Welcome, history lovers, to our journey back in time. Tonight, we're turning the clock back over 200 years, to the dawn of the 19th century in North America. Imagine a continent bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, a world far removed from the bustling cities and digital screens we know today. This is a story that begins not with a bang, but with a whisper. A quiet continent, vast and largely untamed, holding its breath before a period of immense change. Picture the scene. It's a cool, clear night in the year 1803. The stars are a brilliant canopy, untouched by the light pollution of modern times. Below, the land stretches out in a patchwork of ancient forests, sprawling prairies, and majestic mountain ranges. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The only sounds are the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of a lone wolf, and the soft murmur of rivers making their timeless journey to the sea. This is North America in its youth, a continent of two burgeoning nations and countless ancient cultures. To the south, the young United States of America is a nation of farmers, merchants, and pioneers. Its borders are expanding, but much of the country is still a collection of small towns and isolated homesteads, clinging to the eastern seaboard. Cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston are growing, their cobblestone streets lit by the flickering flame of gas lamps. But step just a few miles outside these urban centers, and you're in the wilderness. Let's journey to a small frontier town in the Ohio Valley. The day's work is done. The blacksmith's hammer is silent, the general store is shuttered, and the tavern is quiet. Families are gathered in their log cabins, the warm light from their hearths spilling out into the darkness. A mother hums a lullaby to her child. A father cleans his long rifle by the firelight, and the older children are already fast asleep, dreaming of the adventures tomorrow might bring. Life here is hard, dictated by the seasons and the rhythm of the land. It's a life of self-reliance, community, and a deep connection to the natural world. There's a sense of hope, of building something new, but also a constant awareness of the dangers that lurk just beyond the flickering firelight. Now, let's travel north, across an invisible line drawn on a map, into the lands of British North America, the future Canada. Here, the landscape feels even wilder, the settlements more scattered. In Upper Canada, what we now call Ontario, Loyalist families who fled the American Revolution are carving out new lives from the dense forests. Their communities are small, tight-knit, and fiercely proud of their British heritage. They are building mills along the rivers, clearing land for farms, and establishing a society that is both deeply British and uniquely North American. Further east, in the old cities of Quebec and Montreal, the legacy of New France is alive and well. The French language echoes through the narrow streets, and the stone buildings stand as a testament to a history stretching back centuries. Here, the rhythm of life is different, a blend of European tradition and New World reality. The grand cathedrals stand toll their bells, marking the passing hours, while down at the port fur traders, sailors, and merchants from around the world share stories and trade goods, connecting this corner of the continent to a global network. But these European settlements are just small islands in a vast sea of indigenous lands. For thousands of years, this continent has been home to a rich tapestry of nations and cultures, from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the east to the Cree in the vast subarctic, the Sioux on the Great Plains, and the Salish on the Pacific coast. On this quiet night, their communities are also at peace. In a longhouse, an elder recounts the creation story to a wide-eyed group of children. In a tipi on the plains, a hunter dreams of the next buffalo hunt. Their lives are interwoven with the land, their traditions passed down through generations. They watch the growing presence of the newcomers with a mix of curiosity, caution, and concern. Their world is on the cusp of a profound and often painful transformation. The entire continent is a place of quiet beginnings and simmering potential. Thomas Jefferson is President of the United States, a philosopher-statesman with a grand vision for an empire of liberty. He is about to make a decision that will change the face of the continent forever. The Louisiana Purchase, this single act, will double the size of his country overnight, pushing its frontier deep into the unknown West and setting the stage for decades of exploration, conflict, and expansion. The gears of history are beginning to turn, slowly at first, but with an unstoppable momentum. In Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte is reshaping the old world with his armies, and the shockwaves of his ambitions are felt even here, across the Atlantic. The great powers are vying for control, and North America is a crucial piece on the global chessboard. The trade routes, the natural resources, the strategic territories, all are part of a larger game that will soon draw the United States and Great Britain into another conflict. The peace that hangs over the continent this night is fragile, a temporary calm before the storm. But for now, let's linger in this moment of tranquility. Let's appreciate the immense, quiet beauty of this land before the railroads, before the telegraph, before the great wars and migrations that would redefine it. This is a world where news travels at the speed of a horse, where the night sky is a map of the cosmos, and where the future is an unwritten page. The story of 19th century North America is a dramatic one, filled with epic characters, pivotal battles, and transformative ideas. But all great stories need a beginning, a moment of quiet anticipation. And this is ours, a continent sleeping under a blanket of stars, unaware of the tumultuous dawn that is about to break. Join us as we explore this incredible era. Chapter by chapter, we'll meet the pioneers, the politicians, the warriors, and the visionaries who shaped this land. We'll witness the clash of empires, the birth of nations, and the relentless march of progress. It's a story of hope and hardship, of conflict and cooperation, and it all starts here, on this quiet night in the early 1800s. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you enjoyed this glimpse into a world gone by, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. We have so much more to explore together. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our journey through history. In this chapter, we'll explore the quiet, almost imperceptible beginnings of a tension that would one day erupt into open conflict. Imagine the early 19th century, a time of new nations and shifting frontiers. The United States, a young and ambitious country, and Mexico, newly independent from Spain, were neighbors with vastly different visions for their futures. The stage for their complex relationship was a vast, sparsely populated land called Texas, Mexico. In its early years of nationhood, faced the enormous task of governing immense territories. To populate and develop its northern frontier, it opened Texas to American settlers. It was an invitation, a gesture of goodwill, but it came with conditions. Settlers were expected to become Mexican citizens, adopt the Catholic faith, and abide by Mexican laws, including the abolition of slavery. This policy, known as the Impresario system, was Mexico's attempt to weave these newcomers into the fabric of its own society. Stephen F. Austin, one of the most famous, led the first wave of American families, known as the Old 300, into this new land. They were pioneers, seeking opportunity and a fresh start. Initially, this arrangement seemed to work. The settlers, grateful for the cheap land, pledged their allegiance. But as more and more Americans poured into Texas, the cultural landscape began to change. Most critically, many brought enslaved people, a practice that directly contradicted Mexican law, which had formally abolished slavery in 1829. This created an immediate and fundamental point of friction. The cultural differences weren't just about language or religion. They represented two fundamentally different ways of life, coexisting uneasily on the same soil. As the American population in Texas swelled, it soon outnumbered the Tejano, or Mexican Texan, population. The once welcoming gesture from Mexico City began to look like a threat to its national sovereignty. Concerns grew that this burgeoning English-speaking enclave was becoming a nation within a nation, loyal not to Mexico City, but to Washington, D.C. The Mexican government, watching this demographic shift with alarm, began to reconsider its open-door policy. They saw their control over this vital territory slipping away, not through force, but through migration. The border itself was a source of ambiguity. In this era of uncharted wilderness, maps were often inconsistent. The Nueces River and the Rio Grande were both considered potential boundaries, separated by a wide strip of contested land. This ambiguity wasn't just a cartographical problem. It was a political one. For the settlers, the vague borderlands represented freedom and opportunity. For the Mexican government, They represented a porous frontier, difficult to defend and control. Each side viewed this undefined space through the lens of its own interests and fears. In an attempt to reassert its authority, Mexico passed the law of April 6, 1830. This was a turning point. The law explicitly banned further immigration from the United States, prohibited the importation of enslaved people, and called for stronger military garrisons and customs enforcement in Texas. From Mexico's perspective, this was a necessary step to secure its borders and enforce its laws. But for the American settlers, who had family and economic ties to the U.S., it felt like a betrayal. They saw it as a heavy-handed measure designed to stifle their growth and cut them off from their homeland. The cultural and legal clashes grew more frequent. Settlers accustomed to American-style local governance and trial by jury bristled under Mexico's more centralized, military-administered legal system. Disputes over land titles, taxes, and customs duties became common. These weren't grand battles, but a series of small, persistent irritations, like stones in a shoe, that wore away at the initial goodwill. Each customs post, each legal ruling, each new decree from the distant capital of Mexico City felt like another layer of control, another challenge to the settlers' way of life. Meanwhile, political instability within Mexico itself added to the confusion. The young republic was struggling to find its footing, swinging between federalist systems, which granted more autonomy to states like Texas, and centralist systems, which concentrated power in the capital. This constant political seesawing left the settlers in Texas feeling uncertain and insecure. They had pledged allegiance to a federalist constitution, but now found themselves under the rule of an increasingly powerful central government that seemed indifferent, if not hostile, to their concerns. It's important to remember that this wasn't a story of villains and heroes. It was a story of people and nations with conflicting dreams. Mexico sought to build a unified, sovereign nation, secure within its own borders. The American settlers sought land, opportunity, and the freedom to live according to their own customs. These two dreams, born of different histories and cultures, were set on a collision course in the vast, sun-baked plains of Texas. The seeds of conflict were not sown in a single day of anger, but over years of misunderstanding, diverging paths, and a growing sense of mutual distrust. The invitation had been given, the guests had arrived, but now, the host and the guests were beginning to realize they had very different ideas about the rules of the house. The air was growing heavy with unspoken questions, and the stage was slowly being set for the dramatic events that would follow. Thank you for listening. We invite you to join us for our next chapter, where these simmering tensions finally begin to boil over. Be sure to subscribe and follow our channel so you don't miss it. Welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, in Chapter 3, we're diving deep into a land of two histories. Texas. Before the iconic Lone Star flew, this vast territory was a northern frontier of Mexico. A land rich in history but sparse in population. When Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821, it inherited this massive, untamed region. The new Mexican government was eager to secure its northern border and foster economic growth. But there was a problem. Not many Mexicans wanted to move there. The region was remote, and raids by Comanche and Apache Beatles made life dangerous and uncertain. So, Mexico looked north, to its ambitious and land-hungry neighbor, the United States. To populate the area, Mexico implemented a generous colonization policy. It offered huge tracts of land to impresarios, land agents who agreed to bring in settlers. The most famous of these was Stephen F. Austin, who inherited a land grant from his father, Moses Austin. The deal was simple. Settlers could get land for pennies an acre, a fraction of what it cost in the U.S. in return. They had to pledge loyalty to Mexico, convert to Catholicism, and become Mexican citizens. This offer was irresistible. Thousands of Americans, mostly Southerners, packed their belongings and headed for Texas. They were drawn by the dream of cheap land and a fresh start. They called themselves Texians, and they poured into the fertile river valleys, establishing farms and cotton plantations. By the early 1830s, American immigrants and their slaves outnumbered the native Tejano population, the Spanish-speaking inhabitants of Texas, by nearly 10-1. Initially, the arrangement seemed to work. Stephen F. Austin was a skilled diplomat, mediating between the settlers and the Mexican government. He encouraged the colonists to respect Mexican laws and customs. For a while, a unique blend of cultures began to form. American settlers and Tejanos traded, socialized, and sometimes even They shared a frontier spirit, united by the challenges of taming a wild land. But beneath this surface of cooperation, cultural clashes were brewing. The two groups had fundamentally different views on governance, religion, and, most critically, slavery. The American settlers were overwhelmingly Protestant and accustomed to a high degree of self-government. They bristled at the idea of a strong, centralized authority in far-off Mexico City. They held town meetings and formed local militias, practices rooted in their American political traditions, which sometimes clashed with Mexican law. The issue of religion was another source of friction. While the requirement to convert to Catholicism was often overlooked by local officials, it remained a legal mandate. For the devoutly Protestant settlers, this was a constant, underlying tension, a reminder that they were living under a foreign government with values different from their own. However, the most explosive issue was slavery. Many of the American settlers were from the South, and they brought enslaved people with them to work the cotton and sugar plantations. But in 1829, Mexico officially abolished slavery. It was a moral and political stance for the new republic. The Mexican government granted Texas a temporary exemption from the law, but the writing was on the wall. For the Texian slaveholders, this was a direct threat to their economic livelihood and way of life. They saw the abolition decree as an attack on their property rights and a sign of the Mexican government's untrustworthiness. As the American population swelled, the Mexican government grew increasingly alarmed. They worried they were losing control of their own territory. In 1830, the government passed a law prohibiting further immigration from the United States. It also placed new taxes on imported American goods and sent more troops to Texas to enforce its laws. To the Texians, these measures felt like tyranny. They had come to Texas on the promise of freedom and autonomy, and now they felt the Mexican government was breaking that promise. They saw the new laws as a betrayal and an attempt to stifle their growth and prosperity. The ban on immigration was particularly galling, as it cut them off from friends and family back in the States. Tensions that had been simmering for years now began to boil over. Meanwhile, political turmoil was shaking Mexico City, a relatively stable federalist republic, which had allowed states like Texas a fair amount of autonomy, was being challenged. A new political faction, the Centralists, Cameto Pawe. They wanted to dissolve the state governments and concentrate all power in the hands of the national government. In 1835, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, a charismatic and ambitious military leader, declared himself a dictator and threw out the Mexican Constitution of 1824, which the Texians and many Federalist Tejanos revered. This was the final straw. For the Texians, Santa Anna's power grab confirmed their worst fears. This wasn't just about cultural differences or economic disputes anymore. It was about fundamental rights. They saw Santa Anna as a despot who was stripping them of their liberties. Many Tejanos, like Juan Seguin and Lorenzo de Zavala, also opposed Santa Anna's dictatorship. They had been loyal Mexican citizens, but they believed in the Federalist principles of the 1824 Constitution and saw Santa Anna as a threat to all of Mexico, not just Texas. Stephen F. Austin, who had long advocated for peace and cooperation, traveled to Mexico City to negotiate, to try and find a peaceful solution. He sought to have the immigration ban lifted and to secure separate statehood for Texas within the Mexican Republic, but he was accused of treason and thrown in jail for over a year. When he finally returned to Texas, he was a changed man. The patient diplomat was gone, replaced by a revolutionary who believed that war was the only option. In the fall of 1835, the first shots were fired in the town of Gonzales. Mexican soldiers had come to reclaim a small cannon they had loaned the town for defense. The settlers refused to give it up, raising a homemade flag that read, "Come and take it." A skirmish broke out, and the Texas Revolution had begun. What started as a dispute over land and cultural differences had escalated into a full-blown rebellion. It was a conflict born from two distinct histories converging on one piece of land. On one side were the American settlers, driven by dreams of manifest destiny and fiercely protective of their perceived rights. On the other was a young Mexican nation, struggling to define its own identity and control its vast, unruly borders. The story of Texas under Mexican rule is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It's a complex narrative of ambition, cultural misunderstanding, and conflicting visions for the future. It was a chapter that set the stage for iconic battles like the Alamo and San Jacinto, and ultimately led to the birth of the Republic of Texas. And we'll explore all of that in our next chapter. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into Texas history interesting, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. See you 10. Hello and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we venture into Chapter 4, where the vast, sun-drenched lands of Texas become the stage for a dramatic story of rebellion, independence, and the widening gap between two nations, the United States and Mexico. This isn't just a tale of battles. It is the story of how a single event set in motion a chain reaction that would redefine North America. Our story begins in the 1820s. Mexico, newly independent from Spain, was a massive, sprawling nation with a sparse population in its northern territories. To encourage settlement and development, the Mexican government made a fateful decision. It invited American settlers, known as Anglos, into its province of Texas. As we know it, these settlers were offered generous land grants under a few conditions. They had to pledge allegiance to Mexico, convert to Catholicism, and, crucially, abide by Mexican law, which included the abolition of slavery. At first, this arrangement seemed to work. Thousands of Americans, led by impresarios like Stephen F. Austin, poured into Texas, drawn by the promise of fertile land and a new beginning. They brought with them their culture, their language, and their economic systems, which were heavily reliant on cotton cultivation and, for many, enslaved labor. A vibrant, multicultural society began to take shape, a blend of American ambition and Mexican tradition. But beneath the surface, tensions were simmering. The cultural differences were stark. The American settlers were predominantly Protestant, spoke English, and were accustomed to the principles of American democracy and self-governance. They found it difficult to adapt to Mexico's centralized government, its legal system, and the official requirement to become Catholic. The issue of slavery was a particularly sharp point of friction. Mexico had officially abolished slavery in 1829, a move that directly threatened the economic model of the Anglo-Texan cotton planters. Though temporary exemptions were granted, the writing was on the wall. For these settlers, the Mexican government's stance felt like a direct assault on their way of life and prosperity. As the Anglo population in Texas swelled, it soon outnumbered the Tohono native Spanish-speaking, and this demographic shift created a sense of unease in Mexico City. The Mexican government began to worry that it was losing its grip on this distant, increasingly Americanized province. In 1830, Mexico passed a series of laws aimed at reasserting control. Immigration from the United States was halted, new taxes were imposed, and more troops were sent to the region. To the American settlers, these actions felt oppressive and tyrannical. They had come to Texas seeking freedom and opportunity, but now they felt they were being ruled by a distant, authoritarian government that didn't understand or respect their interests. The political situation in Mexico itself was unstable. In the mid-1830s, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna came to power. He was a charismatic and ambitious leader who dissolved the Mexican Congress and abolished the Federalist Constitution of 1824, which had granted states significant autonomy. He replaced it with a new, centralized system, effectively making himself a dictator. This was the final straw for the Texans. They had settled under the promise of a federalist system, and now that promise was broken. Resistance began to smolder and then ignite. In the fall of 1835, the first shots of the Texas Revolution were fired in the town of Gonzales. The Mexican army had come to retrieve a small cannon, and the Texans met them with a flag that defiantly read, "Come and take it." This small skirmish escalated into a full-blown rebellion. The Texans, a mix of Anglo settlers, and some Tejanos who also opposed Santa Anna's centralist rule, organized a provisional government and an army. Their initial goal wasn't necessarily independence, but a return to the 1824 Constitution. Santa Anna, however, was determined to crush the insurrection. He personally led a large army northward into Texas, intending to make an example of the rebels. This set the stage for one of the most iconic events in American history, the Battle of the Alamo. In early 1836, a small force of about 200 Texan defenders, including famous figures like Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie, fortified themselves in an old Spanish mission in San Antonio de the Alamo. They were vastly outnumbered by Santa Anna's army of several thousand. For 13 days, they held out against a relentless siege. Santa Anna demanded unconditional surrender, but the defenders refused. On March 6, 1836, Santa Anna's forces launched The battle was brutal and short-lived. In the end, nearly all the Texan defenders were killed. While a crushing military defeat, the Alamo became a powerful symbol of courage and sacrifice. The cry, "Remember." The Alamo became the rallying cry for the Texan cause, transforming the struggle from a fight for political rights into a passionate war for independence. Just a few days before the fall of the Alamo, on March 2nd, Texan delegates had formally declared their independence from Mexico, creating the Republic of Texas. The declaration itself was a clear reflection of the widening gap. It echoed the American Declaration of Independence, listing grievances against the Mexican government, accusing it of tyranny and asserting the right to self-government. It laid bare the fundamental conflict, a clash between two different visions of society, law, and governance. Following the Alamo, Santa Anna's army continued its brutal campaign. At Goliad, another Texan force that had surrendered was executed under his orders, an event that further fueled the Texans' outrage and resolve. It seemed as if the revolution was doomed. But the Texan army, now under the command of Sam Houston, was playing a strategic waiting game. Houston retreated eastward, drawing Santa Anna deeper into Texas, stretching his supply lines and wearing down his troops. The climax came on April 21, 1836, at the Battle of San Jacinto. In a surprise attack that lasted a mere 18 minutes, Houston's forces descended upon the resting Mexican army. Shouting, "Remember the Alamo?" and "Remember Goliad," they overwhelmed Santa Anna's troops. The victory was decisive. Hundreds of Mexican soldiers were killed, and crucially, General Santa Anna himself was captured the next day. In exchange for his life, Santa Anna was forced to sign the Treaties of Velasco, which recognized the independence of Texas and set the Rio Grande as its southern border. He was sent back to Mexico, where the government promptly repudiated the treaties, arguing that Santa Anna had signed them under duress and had no authority to give away Mexican territory. Mexico never officially recognized Texas's independence. Interior Texas was still a rebellious province that would one day be brought back into the fold. And so, the Republic of Texas, the Lone Star Republic, was born. It existed as an independent nation for nearly a decade, from 1836 to 1845. But this independence was precarious. The new republic faced immense challenges: a weak economy, constant raids from Native American tribes, and the ever-present threat of a Mexican invasion to reclaim the territory. From the very beginning, many Texans, and a significant portion of the American public, favored annexation by the United States. They saw themselves as culturally and ethnically American, and joining the Union seemed like the natural and most secure course of action. However, the issue of annexation was incredibly divisive within the United States itself. The main sticking point was slavery. Texas was a slave-holding republic, and its admission to the Union would tip the delicate balance of power between free and slave states in Congress. Northern abolitionists and politicians like former President John Quincy Adams vehemently opposed annexation, fearing it would strengthen the slave power and lead to the expansion of slavery into new territories. So, for nearly a decade, the United States officially kept its distance, recognizing Texas's independence, but hesitating to annex it. This period of Texas independence was a critical moment. It cemented the separation between Texas and Mexico, both politically and culturally. It also created a permanent source of friction between the United States and Mexico. The U.S. government's sympathy for the Texan cause, the flow of American volunteers and supplies during the Revolution, and the ongoing talk of annexation were seen by Mexico as a betrayal and a sign of American aggression. Mexico viewed the Texas Revolution not as a genuine local uprising, but as part of a larger, premeditated American plot to seize its territory. This perception, whether entirely accurate or not, created a deep and lasting resentment. The divide between the two nations, which had started with cultural clashes in a remote province, had now become a gaping chasm of diplomatic hostility and mistrust. The unresolved issues Mexico's refusal to recognize Texan independence and the dispute over the true border. With Texas claiming the Rio Grande and Mexico insisting on the Nueces River further north were like a powder keg waiting for a spark. The Texas Revolution, therefore, was much more than a regional conflict. It was the crucial event that set the stage for the next, much larger confrontation. The Mexican-American War. The independence of Texas created an unstable and contested frontier. It entangled the United States in a dispute that would ultimately be settled not by diplomacy, but by war. The bloodshed at the Alamo and San Jacinto was, in many ways, just the beginning of a conflict that would redraw the map of North America and have profound consequences for both nations for generations to come. The story of Texas independence is the story of how the dream of expansion and the defense of sovereignty collided, creating a rift that would lead directly to war. Thank you for joining us for this chapter. Next time, we'll explore how the presidential election of 1844 and the doctrine of manifest destiny finally pushed the United States to annex Texas, lighting the fuse for the war to come. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching. Welcome back to our series on the Mexican-American War. Today, we're diving into Chapter 5, the annexation question, the pivotal moment that pushed nations to the brink of conflict. What if I told you that adding a single star to the American flag was seen not as a celebration, but as an act of war? That's exactly what happened in 1845 with the U.S. annexation of Texas. Let's rewind a bit. Texas, after its revolution in 1836, existed as an independent nation, the Republic of Texas. But from the very beginning, many Texans, a large number of whom were American immigrants, dreamed of joining the United States. This idea, known as annexation, was a hot-button issue in Washington for nearly a decade. Why the hesitation? Well, it was complicated. The main sticking point was slavery. Admitting Texas, a massive slaveholding territory, would dramatically shift the delicate balance of power between free and slave states in the Union. Abolitionists in the North were vehemently opposed, fearing it would strengthen the slave power and lead to the expansion of slavery into new territories. For years, presidents like Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, and William Henry Harrison tiptoed around the issue, preferring to avoid the political firestorm it would surely ignite. But the political winds began to shift with President John Tyler. Seeing annexation as a legacy-defining achievement, Tyler made it a central goal of his administration. He, along with many expansionists, argued that bringing Texas into the fold was America's manifest destiny, a divinely ordained mission to spread across the continent. They also played on fears of foreign influence, suggesting that if the U.S. didn't act, Great Britain might forge an alliance with Texas, creating a powerful rival on America's southwestern border. This argument was a powerful one, tapping into national pride and strategic anxieties. The debate came to a head during the presidential election of 1844. The Whig candidate, Henry Clay, tried to play it safe, waffling on his stance, but the Democratic candidate, James K. Polk, ran on an aggressive, expansionist platform. His campaign slogan was 5440 or fight, referring to a border dispute with Britain and Oregon. But his message was clear. America was on the move. Polk was all in on annexing Texas, and his victory was interpreted as a public mandate for expansion. With Polk's election, the outgoing President Tyler saw his chance. Instead of waiting for a formal treaty, which would require a two-thirds majority in the Senate, he knew he couldn't win. Tyler used a clever political maneuver. He proposed annexation through a joint resolution of Congress, which only required a simple majority in both the House and the Senate. In the final days of his presidency, on March 1, 1845, Congress passed the resolution, and Tyler signed it into law. The official annexation was finalized a few months later. On December 29, 1845, when Texas formally became the 28th state. For the United States, it was a moment of triumph, the fulfillment of a decade-long ambition. But for Mexico, it was a profound betrayal. From Mexico's perspective, this wasn't the annexation of an independent nation. It was the theft of its own territory. Mexico had never officially recognized the independence of Texas. They viewed the Texas Revolution as an internal rebellion, a rogue province that they fully intended to bring back under their control. Interiorized Texas was still a part of Mexico, so when the United States annexed Texas, Mexico saw it as a direct act of aggression, a hostile seizure of their rightful land. The Mexican government had repeatedly warned Washington that annexation would be equivalent to a declaration of war. Imagine your neighbor's house has a room that you believe is still yours. One day, a powerful third party comes along, signs a deal with the person living in that room, and declares it part of their own property. You'd feel robbed and provoked, right? That's how Mexico felt. The Mexican minister in Washington, Juan Almonte, immediately protested the move as the most unjust act of aggression which can be found in the annals of modern history. He demanded his passports and severe diplomatic relations with the United States. The message was unmistakable. The diplomatic path was closed. With annexation a reality, both sides began to brace for the inevitable. The U.S. saw it as securing their new territory, while Mexico saw it as preparing to defend their national sovereignty. The stage for conflict was now set, but one major issue remained unresolved: the border. Texas claimed its southern border was the Rio Grande. Mexico insisted the border was the Nueces River, about 150 miles further north. This disputed territory between the two rivers would become the tinderbox. President Polk, not content with just Texas, sent U.S. troops under General Zachary Taylor into this disputed zone. His orders were to advance to the Rio Grande. To the Americans, this was a defensive move, positioning troops on what they now considered American soil. To the Mexicans, it was a full-scale military invasion of their country. They saw armed American soldiers marching deep into territory that had always been part of the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. Mexican forces were also ordered to the region to defend their border at the Rio Grande. It was a standoff. Two armies, representing two nations with irreconcilable views, were now facing each other across a river. Each side believed it was in the right. The Americans, fueled by manifest destiny, saw themselves as pioneers, claiming their rightful land. The Mexicans, their national pride wounded and their territory violated, saw themselves as defenders against a powerful and greedy aggressor. The air was thick with tension. Soldiers on both sides eyed each other warily. Generals exchanged tense letters, each demanding the other retreat. Every patrol, every scout, every movement carried the risk of sparking a conflict that could no longer be contained by diplomacy. The annexation of Texas had lit the fuse. Now, all it would take was a single spark in the desolate land between the Nueces and the Rio Grande to ignite the Mexican-American War. And that spark was about to happen. Thanks for watching. Join us next time as we explore the first shots fired along the Rio Grande and the official outbreak of the war. If you're finding this series informative, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. See you 10. Welcome back to our series. Today, we dive into Chapter 6, Two Nations at the Boundary Line. We re-standing on the precipice of a conflict that would forever reshape the map of North America. The year is 1846, and the air between the United States and Mexico is thick with tension. At the heart of it all, a strip of land, a disputed territory that both nations claimed as their own. Imagine this: a vast, sun-scorched landscape between two powerful rivers. To the Americans, their rightful border was the mighty Rio Grande, a natural boundary that stretched 4 miles. President James K. Polk, a firm believer in manifest destiny, was adamant. He saw the Rio Grande as the undeniable southern edge of Texas, and by extension, the United States. This wasn't just about land. It was about national pride, expansion, and a vision for a coast-to-coast nation. The message from Washington, D.C. was clear. The land up to the Rio Grande was American soil, but travel north from the Rio Grande, about 150 miles, and you'll find another river, the Nueces. For Mexico, this was the true historical boundary of Texas. For centuries, under Spanish and then Mexican rule, the territory of Texas had never extended beyond the Nueces River. The land between the two rivers was part of the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. From Mexico City's perspective, the American claim was an outrageous overreach, an aggressive attempt to seize land that was unequivocally theirs. The Mexican government, already reeling from the loss of Texas, refused to concede another inch. For them, the Nueces River was the line in the sand, a non-negotiable border steeped in history and law. So, you have two nations, two rivers, and two completely different versions of the truth. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was a fundamental clash of national identity and ambition. This contested zone, the Nueces Strip, became a geopolitical powder keg. It was a sparsely populated, wild territory, but its symbolic importance was immense. Whoever controlled this land held the key to the future of the entire region. As diplomatic efforts crumbled, both sides began to move their pieces on this vast chessboard. President Polk, determined to enforce the American claim, made a fateful decision. He ordered General Zachary Taylor and his army of observation to march south. Their mission, to advance from their position on the Nueces River all the way to the northern bank of the Rio Grande. This was a provocative move, a direct challenge to Mexican sovereignty. Picture the scene as dusk settles over the riverland. The sky is a canvas of deep purples and fiery oranges. The usual sounds of the wilderness, the call of birds, the rustle of unseen creatures are now punctuated by something new, something ominous. The rhythmic tramp of soldiers' boots, the jingle of harnesses, the low murmur of commands. American troops, thousands of them, are moving into position, setting up camp right across the water from the Mexican town of Across the Rio Grande, Mexican forces under General Mariano Arista watched this encroachment with growing alarm. To them, this wasn't an observation army, it was an invading force. American soldiers were setting up artillery, building a fort, and flying the stars and stripes on what Mexico considered its own soil. The tension was palpable. You could feel it in the quiet stares of the sentries on both sides of the river, in the anxious letters soldiers wrote home, in the silent prayers of the civilians caught in the middle. Every day, the situation grew more volatile. Each nation saw the other as the aggressor. The Americans believed they were simply occupying their own territory. The Mexicans believed they were defending their homeland from foreign invaders. It was a standoff. A silent war of nerves played out under the vast Texas sky. The soldiers were young, far from caught in a political storm they couldn't control. They patrolled the riverbanks, their eyes scanning the opposite shore, knowing that the first shot could come at any moment. This wasn't just a border dispute anymore. It was a direct confrontation. The quiet, tense evenings along the Rio Grande were the calm before the storm. The movement of Taylor's troops into this disputed zone was the spark that would ignite the Mexican-American War, a conflict that would have profound consequences for both nations. The quiet riverlands were about to become a bloody battleground. What happened next would be etched into the history books. On April 25, 1846, a Mexican cavalry detachment crossed the Rio Grande and ambushed a U.S. Army patrol. Blood was shed on the contested soil. When news of this Thornton affair reached Washington, President Polk had the justification he needed. He went before Congress and famously declared that Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil. Congress declared war, and the conflict began in earnest. But it all started here, in Tis Dusty, disputed land between two rivers. It began with the slow, deliberate march of troops into a territory where sovereignty was the question and cannons were the answer. The quiet tension of those evenings at dusk erupted into a full-blown war that would redefine a continent. The story of the Nueces Strip is a powerful reminder of how lines on a map can become battle lines on the ground. It's a tale of ambition, pride, and the tragic human costs of a border dispute. The silent river, which had flowed for millennia, was now a witness to the clash of two nations, its waters reflecting the fires of a conflict that was just beginning. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a critical moment in history. The events that unfolded here set the stage for everything that followed. If you found this chapter fascinating, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll explore the opening battles of the war. We'll see you then. In the spring of 1846, the vast, sun-scorched lands between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande simmered with tension. 4 months. 4 months. This disputed territory had been a chessboard for two nations on the brink of conflict. The United States and Mexico. While diplomats exchanged increasingly sharp letters, soldiers eyed each other across the dusty plains. The air was thick, not just with heat, but with the heavy anticipation of a storm about to break. This wasn't just a border dispute anymore. It was a clash of destinies, a collision of national ambitions. And all it would take was a single spark to ignite the entire frontier into a blaze of war. That spark was about to be struck. At the heart of this standoff was American General Zachary Taylor. Under direct orders from President James K. Polk, he had marched his army of occupation south from Corpus Christi, leaving the Nueces River, the historical boundary of Texas, recognized by Mexico far behind. His destination was the northern bank of the Rio Grande. To the Mexican government, this was an audacious, illegal invasion of their sovereign territory. To President Polk, it was the rightful assertion of American claims, as the United States now recognized Rio Grande as the southern border of its newest state, Texas. Taylor's army established a makeshift fort directly across the river from the Mexican city of They named it Fort Texas. From its earthen walls, American soldiers could see the Mexican troops gathering, their flags snapping in the wind. The two armies were now literally a stone's throw apart. 4 weeks, an uneasy quiet held. Soldiers would sometimes call out to each other across the water, a strange, fleeting camaraderie in the face of inevitable hostility. But the commanders on both sides knew this fragile peace couldn't last. The Mexican general, Mariano Arista, had issued a proclamation, declaring that the American presence was an act of war and that he was prepared to defend Mexican soil. The stage was set. On April 24th, 1846, General Arista made his move. He informed Taylor that hostilities had officially commenced. The next day, he sent a large cavalry force, some 1,600 strong, under the command of General Anastasio Torajan, across the Rio Grande. Their mission was to scout the American positions and, if possible, cut off their supply lines. General Taylor, learning of the river crossing, dispatched a patrol of his own to investigate. He chose Captain Seth Thornton to lead a company of U.S. dragoons. About 63 men in total. Their orders were simple: ascertain the enemy's location and strength, but avoid a direct confrontation if possible. Captain Thornton was a confident, perhaps overconfident, officer. As his dragoons rode out from camp, they ventured deep into the contested chaparral, a dense, thorny brush that made visibility difficult and ambushes easy. A local guide led them to a large, abandoned ranch known as Rancho de Caricitos, enclosed by a high fence. The guide insisted that Torajan's men were inside. Thornton, trusting the local intelligence, led his men through a narrow gate into the ranch's corral. It was a fatal mistake. As soon as the last American dragoon entered the enclosure, the trap was sprung. General Torrejon's cavalry, who had been lying in wait, swarmed them from all sides. The Americans were hopelessly outnumbered and completely surrounded. The first shots of the Mexican-American War echoed through the dense brush. The dragoons, caught in a chaotic crossfire, fought back bravely but were overwhelmed. The fighting was fierce, hand-to-hand in some cases, but it was over quickly. Captain Thornton was one of the first to be captured. In the skirmish, 11 of his men were killed, 6 were wounded, and the rest, nearly 50 soldiers, were taken prisoner. Only a handful of wounded men managed to escape the chaos and stumble back to General Taylor's camp with the news. When the survivors reached Fort Texas, their report sent shockwaves through the American command. General Taylor immediately sent a dispatch rider on a frantic journey to Washington, D.C. The message was stark and urgent. Hostilities had commenced. The news traveled by horse and steamship, taking nearly 2 weeks to reach the capital. When it finally arrived on the evening of Saturday, May 9th, it landed like a thunderclap. President Polk had already been drafting a war message to Congress, based on Mexico's refusal to negotiate and other grievances. But this news gave him the justification he had been waiting for, the perfect casus belli. Polk worked through the night and all day Sunday with his cabinet. He reframed his entire argument. The issue was no longer just about unpaid debts or rejected diplomats. It was now about an attack, an invasion, a spilling of American blood. The narrative had shifted dramatically. This was no longer a war of choice or expansion. It was now framed as a war of defense, of national honor. On Monday, May 11, 1846, President James K. Polk stood before a joint session of Congress. His voice was steady, his words carefully chosen and powerful. He recounted the events, describing Captain Thornton's patrol as a peaceful reconnaissance mission that was ambushed without provocation. He painted a vivid picture of American soldiers falling on what he now defined, uniquivocaji, as American land. Then, he delivered the line that would echo through history, the line that would galvanize a nation and seal the fate of two countries. He declared, "Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory and shed American blood upon the American soil." The phrase was electric. American blood on American soil. It was a masterful piece of political rhetoric. It ignored the fact that the soil in question was disputed territory that Mexico had controlled for decades. It overlooked the fact that the American Army's presence there was seen by Mexico as the initial act of aggression. But in the charged atmosphere of Washington, those nuances were swept aside. The appeal to patriotism and national pride was overwhelming. Polk wasn't asking Congress if they should go to war. He was telling them that war had already been thrust upon them. As he put it, war exists, and, notwithstanding all our efforts to avoid it, exists by the act of Mexico herself. The declaration was met with a surge of patriotic fervor. In the House of Representatives, the war resolution was passed with a resounding vote of 174 to 14 inte Senate. It passed 42. Critics, like a young Abraham Lincoln who would later challenge Polk's spot resolution, questioning the exact spot where blood was shed, were drowned out by the drums of war. The spark struck at Rancho de Caricitos had become a raging inferno. The shots fired along the Rio Grande had not just started a skirmish. They had launched a full-scale war, a conflict that would redraw the map of North America and forever alter the destiny of the United States. The path to California and the Pacific was now to be paved with conflict. Thanks for watching. If you found this chapter of history compelling, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode, where the battles for Texas truly begin. The air hangs heavy and humid, thick with the scent of chaparral and the promise of a coming storm. We're in South Texas. The year is 1846, and the world is on the cusp of change. General Zachary Taylor, a man known more for his plain-spoken manner than his military polish, finds himself and his army of occupation staring across a contested strip of land. Before them lies the Rio Grande, a ribbon of water that has become a line in the sand. Beyond it, Mexico. The march begins not with a bang, but with the quiet, rhythmic tramp of thousands of boots on dusty soil. Taylor's army, a small but determined force, moves south from Corpus Christi toward the river. The landscape is a character in itself, a vast, flat coastal plain, dotted with thorny brush and mesquite trees. The sun beats down relentlessly, a constant companion on this journey into the unknown. To soldiers, men from farms and cities across the United States, feel the weight of their wool uniforms, the strain of their heavy packs, and the unspoken tension of what lies ahead. Their destination is a strategic point on the north bank of the Rio Grande, directly across from the Mexican town of Matamoros. Here, Taylor orders the construction of a crude but functional star-shaped earthwork fort. It would later be named Fort Brown, as the American flag is raised over its walls. It's a defiant signal, a claim staked in disputed territory. Across the shimmering water, the Mexican forces under General Mariano Arista watch and wait. The atmosphere is electric, a silent standoff under the wide-open Texan sky. The first real test comes not in a charge or a volley, but in a long, grueling march. News arrives that the supply lines back to the coast at Point Isabel are threatened. Taylor knows he cannot be cut off. Leaving a small garrison to hold the fort, he takes the bulk of his army and retraces his steps. It's a strategic retreat, a move to secure his base. The men march back through the same thorny scrubland, the dust clinging to them, the heat shimmering off the ground. With supplies secured, the return journey begins. But this time, the path is blocked. On a wide, open prairie called Palo Alto, which means tall timber in Spanish, General Arista's army is waiting. They are a formidable sight, their colorful uniforms and polished lances stretching across the plain. The Mexican force outnumbers the Americans, and their cavalry is renowned. The stage is set for the first major engagement of the war. The afternoon of May 8th is still and hot. Taylor, observing the enemy line, makes a crucial decision. Instead of ordering a direct infantry assault against a superior force, he relies on his artillery. This is where the Battle of Palo Alto is truly fought with cannons. The American flying artillery, light, mobile cannons that could be quickly repositioned, proves devastatingly effective. Imagine the scene, not the chaos of close-quarters combat, but a duel of big guns across a grassy field. The American cannons fire with speed and precision. The air fills with the deep boom of their discharge and the high whistle of cannonballs tearing through the air. The tall prairie grass catches fire, and thick, acrid smoke billows across the battlefield, obscuring the lines of soldiers, creating a surreal, hazy landscape. The Mexican artillery, heavier and less mobile, struggles to respond effectively. For hours, this thunderous exchange continues, a contest of technology and tactics. As dusk falls, the Mexican army, having suffered significant losses from the relentless barrage, withdraws from the field. Palo Alto is an American victory, won not by the bayonet, but by the cannon. The next day, May 9th, Taylor's army advances. They find that Arista has not retreated far. He has chosen a new position, one that offers a stark contrast to the open plains of Palo Alto. This is Resaca de la Palma, a dried-up riverbed, a winding ravine overgrown with dense thickets of palm trees and thorny brush. It's a natural trench, a perfect place for an ambush. The terrain negates the American artillery advantage and favors close quarters, hand-to-hand fighting. The Battle of Resaca de la Palma is a chaotic, tangled affair. The neat lines of the previous day are gone, replaced by small unit actions in the dense undergrowth. Soldiers push through thorny thickets, visibility limited to just a few feet. The sounds of battle are more personal. Hear the crack of muskets, the shouts of officers, the clash of steel. It's a soldier's fight, a confusing and brutal struggle in the semi-tropical jungle. American dragoons, the cavalry of their day, are ordered to charge down the main road to break the Mexican center and capture their cannons. It's a desperate, daring move. They gallop into the heart of the Resaca, fighting hand-to-hand with the Mexican gunners. The chaos is immense. Units become separated, officers lose track of their men, and the battle dissolves into a series of frantic, isolated skirmishes within the tangled ravine. But slowly, doggedly, the American infantry pushes forward, clearing sections of the dense chaparral. The pressure on the Mexican line becomes unbearable. The discipline that held at Palo Alto begins to fracture in the closing confusion of the Resaca. By late afternoon, the Mexican forces are in full retreat, streaming back towards the Rio Grande in disarray. Many attempt to swim the river to the safety of Matamoros, but the current is strong. The victory is complete and decisive. In just 2 days, the character of the conflict has been established. Taylor, the unassuming general, has proven to be a steady and effective commander. His army, though small, has shown its resilience and the effectiveness of its modern artillery. The path into northern Mexico is now open. The initial standoff at the Rio Grande has erupted into a full-scale war. Following the victory at Resaca de la Palma, Taylor crosses the Rio Grande, and the American army enters Matamoros. Without a fight, the Mexican forces have withdrawn deeper into their own territory. For the American soldiers, it's a profound moment. They are now truly in a foreign land, a place of different customs, a different language, and a landscape that is both beautiful and forbidding. The initial march is over, but the campaign is just beginning. The army must now prepare to push further south, into Tabastarade, interior of northern Mexico. towards the heavily fortified city of Monterrey. This next phase of the march is a test of endurance. The summer heat is relentless. Water is scarce. The terrain is rugged and unforgiving, a landscape of rocky hills, deep canyons, and endless desert scrub. The supply lines are stretched thin, and disease begins to take a toll, a more silent but equally dangerous foe than the one they face on the battlefield. As they move deeper into Mexico, the soldiers see a world entirely new to them. They march through small villages with adobe houses and ancient churches, encountering civilians who watch them with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and resentment. The army becomes a moving city, a column of thousands of men, wagons, and animals snaking its way through the starkly beautiful but harsh Mexican landscape. General Taylor, riding his horse, Old Whitey, remains a constant, reassuring presence for his men. He shares their hardships, his simple, informal style earning him the affectionate nickname Old Rough and Ready. He is not a man of grand strategies or intricate plans, but a leader who understands logistics, morale, and the importance of a steady, forward push. The march south is a slow, deliberate crawl. Each mile is hard-won, not against an enemy army, but against the environment itself. The sun-baked earth, the lack of water, the sheer distance, these are the primary obstacles. It's a campaign defined as much by movement and geography as it is by combat. The story of this early phase of the war is written in the dusty footprints of soldiers marching under a brassy sky, deeper and deeper into the heart of Mexico. The initial battles have been won, but the true cost of this march is yet to be counted. Thank you for joining us on this journey back in time. If you found this chapter of history compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories from the past. We appreciate your support and look forward to seeing you in the next one. Welcome back to our series on the Mexican-American War. Today, we're diving into Chapter 9, the rise of General Winfield Scott, a military mind whose brilliance would fundamentally change the course of the conflict. By early 1847, the war had reached a critical juncture. While American forces under Zachary Taylor had won significant victories in the north, these battles hadn't broken Mexico's resolve to fight. The Mexican government refused to negotiate, believing that the heart of their country was still untouchable. It became clear to President James K. Polk and his advisors in Washington that a new, more decisive strategy was needed. The objective had to be Mexico City itself. But how to get there? Marching an army hundreds of miles overland from the north, through arid deserts and hostile territory, was a logistical nightmare. It was a high-risk, low-reward proposition. This is where General Winfield Scott enters the picture, a figure who had been waiting in the wings, a man whose military vision was about to be unleashed. Winfield Scott was, in many ways, the polar opposite of the rough-and-ready Zachary Taylor, nicknamed Old Fuss and Feathers for his meticulous attention to military decorum, his strict discipline, and his elaborate uniforms. Scott was a student of war in the grand European tradition. He was a professional soldier to his core, a man who believed in planning, logistics, and overwhelming preparation. He wasn't a general who relied on gut instinct. He relied on intelligence, engineering, and a deep understanding of military history and theory. For years, Scott had been the commanding general of the U.S. Army, but political rivalries had kept him in Washington, away from a field command. Now, with the war stalled, his moment had arrived. Scott proposed a plan that was audacious, risky, and brilliant. It was a strategy that had never been attempted by the United States on such a scale. He advocated for an amphibious invasion, landing a massive American army on the coast of Mexico and marching inland to capture the capital. This was a complex, multi-stage operation that would require an incredible level of coordination between the Army and the Navy. It was a gamble of epic proportions. If the landing failed, it would be a disaster. If the Army was defeated on its march to the capital, it would be stranded deep in enemy territory with no line of retreat. Many in Washington were skeptical, but Scott's confidence and the sheer logic of his plan were persuasive. He argued that a direct strike at the political and economic heart of Mexico was the only way to force a swift and decisive end to the war. The target for this unprecedented invasion was Veracruz, Mexico's most important port on the Gulf Coast. Veracruz was not just a strategic city. It was a fortress. The city was protected by massive walls, and, most formidably, by the island fortress of San Juan de Ulua, a stone citadel that had stood for centuries and was considered one of the strongest fortifications in the Americas. A direct assault on the fortress and the city was deemed suicidal. It would result in thousands of American casualties and could bog the army down in a long, bloody siege. This is where Scott's meticulous nature truly shone. He didn't plan to storm the fortress. Instead, his plan was to bypass it. Scott and his key staff, including a young and talented engineer named Robert E. Lee, conducted a daring reconnaissance of the coastline. Under the cover of darkness, they scouted for a suitable landing beach, a place where thousands of soldiers and their equipment could be brought ashore quickly and with minimal opposition. They found the perfect spot, Collado Beach, a few miles south of Veracruz, just out of range of the powerful cannons of San Juan de Ulua. The plan was set. On the morning of March 9, 1847, the American invasion fleet, a massive armada of over 100 ships commanded by Commodore David Cana, appeared off the coast of Veracruz. The people of the city watched in awe and terror as this huge naval force assembled. Under Scott's precise direction, the operation began. In a perfectly choreographed sequence, thousands of American soldiers boarded surfboats. As the warships provided covering fire, the boats rowed towards the shore in long, orderly lines. The landing was a masterpiece of military logistics and execution. It was almost unopposed. Mexican commanders in Veracruz were caught completely by surprise, expecting a direct attack on the city's harbor, not a landing on an open beach to their south. Within a few hours, over 10,000 American soldiers were ashore, forming a beachhead and securing the area. It was the largest amphibious operation in U.S. history up to that point, and it had been executed with stunning precision and minimal casualties. The first, most dangerous phase of Scott's grand strategy was a resounding success. With his army safely on Mexican soil, Scott's methodical approach continued. Instead of immediately launching a bloody frontal assault on Veracruz, he chose to encircle it. His engineers, again with Robert E. Lee playing a crucial role, began constructing a line of siege works, digging trenches, and establishing artillery batteries that completely surrounded the city from the landward side. The American Navy completed the blockade from the sea. Veracruz was cut off, trapped. Scott then issued a demand for a surrender to the Mexican commander, General Juan Morales. He hoped to take the city without further bloodshed, but Morales, bound by honor and duty, refused. Scott was left with no choice. He wanted to avoid a prolonged siege that would drain his resources and expose his army to the deadly threat of yellow fever, which was common in the coastal lowlands and would become more prevalent as the weather warmed. So, on March 22nd, Scott ordered a sustained bombardment of the city. For 4 days and nights, American cannons and heavy mortar rained down a devastating barrage of shells on Veracruz. The bombardment was terrifying and destructive, not only targeting military fortifications, but also falling on residential areas, causing immense suffering among the civilian population. This was a brutal aspect of 19th century warfare, and Scott's decision remains controversial. However, from his military perspective, it was a necessary cruelty to force a quick surrender and save his own army from the ravages of disease and a protracted fight. The relentless shelling broke the will of the defenders and the city's inhabitants. The civilian leadership and foreign consuls within Veracruz pleaded with General Morales to capitulate to end the suffering. Finally, on March 27th, Morales surrendered. The American flag was raised over the city in the fortress of San Juan de Ulua. In less than 3 weeks, Winfield Scott had captured one of Mexico's strongest cities, secured a vital base of operations, and validated his entire strategic concept. He had done so with fewer than 100 casualties in his own army. The fall of Veracruz was a monumental achievement and a turning point in the war. It demonstrated the strategic genius and meticulous planning of Winfield Scott. Old Fuss and Feathers had proven that his attention to detail, his belief in logistics, and his modern approach to warfare were incredibly effective. He now had a secure port to supply his army for the next, even more daunting phase of his campaign. The 260-mile march from the coast, up through the mountains, to the halls of Montezuma in Mexico City. The path was now open, but it would be fraught with peril, leading to some of the most dramatic and hard-fought battles of the entire war. Thank you for for watching. We'll explore that incredible march to Mexico City in our next chapter. If you're finding this series informative, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell for notifications so you don't miss the next episode. We'll see you then. The year is 1847. The moon hangs like a silver coin in the vast, inky sky over the Gulf of Mexico. Below, a fleet of American warships rocks gently on the dark, swelling waters. They are a city of shadows and masts, their silhouettes stark against the starlit horizon. This isn't just another naval maneuver. It's the prelude to something the world has never seen before on this scale. The Mexican-American War has reached a pivotal moment, and the target is Veracruz, the most formidable fortress in the Western Hemisphere, the gateway to Mexico City itself. On board these vessels, thousands of soldiers wait. They check their muskets. They write letters home by the flickering light of way-low lamps. They murmur prayers. The air is thick with a mixture of salt, sweat, and anticipation. For many, this is their first taste of war. For all of them, what comes next will be a leap into the unknown. General Winfield Scott, the architect of this audacious plan, knows the stakes. A direct assault on Veracruz would be a bloodbath. The city's walls are thick, its cannons are many, and its defenders are proud. He needs to outthink his opponent, not just outfight him. His plan is as daring as it is brilliant. An amphibious landing, the largest in American history, a complex ballet of ships, surf boats, and soldiers, all aimed at a single stretch of beach just south of the city. The chosen spot is Colado Beach. It's a crescent of sand, seemingly quiet, deceptively peaceful. From the decks of the ships, officers peer through spyglasses, scanning the shore for any sign of Mexican troops, any hint of an ambush. They see nothing but the gentle break of waves and the dark line of dunes. As dusk begins to bleed into night on March 9th, the order is given. The operation begins. It's a scene of controlled chaos, a masterpiece of naval logistics. The massive warships, too large to get close to shore, act as anchors. From their sides, a swarm of specially designed surf boats are lowered into the water, each one capable of carrying about 80 men. These boats are the key. They are the bridge between the sea and the land. Soldiers, weighed down with rifles, ammunition, and gear, begin their perilous descent down rope ladders into the bobbing surf boats. In the dim light, it's a treacherous task. One slip could mean a fall into the dark water, weighed down by their equipment. But they are disciplined, moving with a quiet urgency. The boats fill up, one by one, a flotilla of determined men packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces grim in the twilight. The first wave pushes off. Oars dip into the water in near-perfect unison, propelling the boats toward the distant shore. From the fleet, the Navy provides a thunderous overture. Gunships move closer to the coast, their cannons unleashing a deafening barrage aimed at the dunes and the jungle beyond. The sky ignites with the flash of cannon fire, and the air trembles with the roar. It's not aimed at any specific target, but it serves a crucial purpose: to intimidate, to suppress any potential resistance, to make the Mexican defenders think twice before showing themselves. Imagine being in one of those boats. The sound of the naval bombardment is a constant, gut-shaking thunder behind you. Ahead, the beach gets closer and closer. The moon provides just enough light to see the white foam of the surf. Every man is scanning the shoreline, expecting the flash of muskets, the roar of a hidden cannon. The tension is almost unbearable. This is the moment of maximum vulnerability, caught between the sea and the sand, a perfect target. The first boat scrapes against the sand. The ramp drops, and with a cheer, the first American soldiers leap into the knee-deep water, splashing their way onto Mexican soil. It's General William Worth's division, the vanguard of the invasion. They scramble up the beach, rifles at the ready, forming a defensive line, their eyes probing the shadows of the dunes. More boats arrive, then more, a steady, relentless stream of men and equipment pouring onto the shore. Remarkably, there is no opposition. The beach is undefended. The Mexican command, perhaps believing a landing at that spot was impossible or simply caught by surprise by the scale and speed of the operation, failed to contest it. The naval bombardment had done its job perfectly, keeping any potential defenders hunkered down and away from the landing zone. The Americans had expected a bloody fight on the beaches. Instead, they were met with an eerie silence, broken only by the crash of the surf and the distant thunder of their own guns. Within a few hours, a miracle of military precision unfolds. Over 10,000 American soldiers are successfully landed on the beach without a single life lost to enemy action. It's a staggering achievement. As night deepens, the beach transforms into a sprawling, makeshift city. Campfires flicker to life, casting long, dancing shadows. Men set up tents, dig defensive positions, and unload supplies. The candlelight from the encampment makes the shore twinkle, a mirror to the stars above. The ships in the bay become a backdrop, their lights reflecting on the calm water. The landing is a success, but it's only the first step. The real challenge lies ahead. The city of Veracruz itself. From their new positions on the sand, the soldiers can see its formidable walls, the spires of its churches silhouetted against the night sky. The city is a sleeping giant, and they have just landed on its doorstep. The siege is about to begin. The fate of the war, and of two nations, now hangs on what will happen in the coming days, right here, on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. The amphibious landing at Veracruz was more than just a battle tactic. It was a declaration. It showed the world the growing might and logistical capability of the United States military. It was a complex and dangerous gamble that paid off spectacularly, setting the stage for the final, decisive campaign of the war. The image of those soldiers landing on a moonlit beach, backed by the power of a modern fleet, would become an iconic moment in American history, a precursor to the massive amphibious assaults of the 20th century. The siege had begun, and the road to the halls of Montezuma was now open. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history as fascinating as I do, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. See you next time. The long, arduous journey had taken them from the coast, through the oppressive heat of the lowlands, and now, finally, into the cooler air of the highlands. This was the beginning of the Great March to Mexico City, a trek that would define the campaign and the fate of two nations. For the American soldiers under General Winfield Scott, the path ahead was not just a road, but a formidable challenge carved through the heart of Mexico. It was a landscape of stark contrasts. Towering mountains that clawed at the sky and vast, dusty plains that stretched to the horizon. As they began their ascent, the world around them transformed. The air grew thin and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. They moved through narrow mountain passes, where the sheer rock faces seemed to lean in on them, echoing the sound of their own shuffling feet and the creak of wagon wheels. These were ancient corridors, paths that had been trod for centuries by traders, travelers, and armies before them. Every step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. The soldiers, far from home and weary from the battles at Veracruz, looked up at the peaks with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Each bend in the road could conceal an ambush, each shadow a potential threat. The army snaked its way through the landscape like a great, blue-clad serpent. It was a slow, methodical advance. The days were marked by the rising and setting of the sun, the rhythm of the march broken only by brief halts for water and rest. They passed through quiet, sun-baked villages, little clusters of adobe homes that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. The villagers would watch them pass, their faces unreadable, a mixture of fear, curiosity, and resentment in their dark eyes. Children would sometimes peek from behind doorways, their silent gazes following the long column of foreign soldiers until it disappeared into the dust. For the troops, these villages were fleeting glimpses of a life they couldn't comprehend, a stark reminder of how far from their own world they truly were. The strategy was one of deliberate, careful movement. General Scott, ever the meticulous planner, knew that his supply lines were stretched thin and vulnerable. He couldn't afford a reckless dash. Instead, the march was a calculated game of chess, played across a vast geographical board. The focus was on securing key positions, controlling the high ground, and ensuring the army could sustain itself in hostile territory. Scouts ranged far ahead, mapping the terrain, searching for water sources, and watching for any sign of Santa Anna's forces. The main body of the army followed, a moving city of infantry, artillery, and supply wagons. Its progress slow but relentless. One of the first major obstacles was the pass at Cerro Gordo. Here, the Mexican army, under General Santa Anna himself, had prepared a formidable defense. They had fortified the heights overlooking the main road, creating a bottleneck where they believed Scott's army would be trapped and annihilated. The American engineers, however, discovered a hidden, rugged path that skirted the main Mexican defenses. Under the cover of darkness and dense foliage, they began the painstaking work of cutting a trail through the wilderness, wide enough for infantry and even light artillery to pass. It was a monumental feat of engineering and stealth. The ensuing battle was a masterpiece of maneuver rather than a simple bloody confrontation. While a small force made a diversionary attack on the front of the Mexican lines, the main American force used the newly cut path to sweep around the flank. They emerged from the woods to strike the Mexican rear, catching them completely by surprise. The carefully constructed defenses crumbled in a matter of hours. It wasn't about the intensity of the fighting, but the brilliance of the strategy. The victory at Cerro Gordo opened the road to the city of Jalapa, and then onward to the strategic high-ground city of Puebla. The march could continue. From Puebla, the army had a clear view of the two great volcanoes, Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, their snow-capped peaks shimmering in the distance like ghostly sentinels. They stood guard over the Valley of Mexico, the final destination. The sight was both inspiring and intimidating. The air here was thinner, the sun harsher. The long, dusty roads became a defining feature of the journey. Dust was a constant companion. It coated their uniforms, got into their food, and stung their eyes. It rose in great, choking clouds with every step, a constant, gritty reminder of the arid, unforgiving landscape. The advance slowed as they approached the Valley of Mexico. Santa Anna, having regrouped his forces, prepared to make his last stand at the gates of the capital. He fortified the natural causeways and marshy approaches to Mexico City, believing them to be impenetrable. Again, Scott's strategy relied on movement and avoiding the enemy's strengths. He chose not to attack the heavily defended eastern approaches. Instead, he ordered another daring flanking maneuver, this time a wide, sweeping march to the south of the city, across a seemingly impassable volcanic rock field known as the Pedregal. This was perhaps the most audacious move of the campaign. The Pedregal was a chaotic landscape of sharp, black, volcanic rock, a nightmare for any army to cross. But a route was found. Over 2 days, the American army struggled across this treacherous terrain, dragging cannons and supply wagons over the jagged rocks. It was a slow, grueling process that tested the limits of their endurance. When they emerged on the other side, they had once again bypassed Santa Anna's main defenses and were now positioned to strike the city from its less protected southern flank. The battles that followed at Contreras and Churubusco were sharp and decisive, but they were the result of this strategic positioning. By constantly outmaneuvering the Mexican army, by choosing the path of greatest resistance, but also greatest surprise, Scott had consistently placed his troops in a position to win. The focus was always on the movement, the long march that brought them to the decisive point on the battlefield. It was a campaign won not just by the bayonet, but by the compass, the map, and the sheer will to keep moving forward. Finally, they stood before the great city itself. The long march was nearing its end. From the villages of the coast to the mountain passages, across dusty plains and volcanic fields, the journey had been a relentless test of will and strategy. It was a story written not just in the clamor of battle, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of boots on the ground. In the long shadows stretching across an alien landscape, and in the unwavering advance towards a destination that had once seemed impossibly far away. The spires of Mexico City were now in sight. The final chapter of this long, arduous march about to be written. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. If you enjoyed this atmospheric look at the march to Mexico City, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the past. Your support helps us continue telling these incredible stories. We'll see you in the next chapter. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our series on the Mexican-American War. Today, in Chapter 12, we're rediving into the dramatic return of one of Mexico's most controversial figures, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Just when you think he's out of the picture, he always finds a way back in, doesn't he? So, let's set the stage. It's 1846. The war has just begun, and Mexico is in political chaos. The government, under President Mariano Paradis, is weak and struggling to mount an effective defense. The treasury is empty, the army is disorganized, and the country is deeply divided between different political factions: the centralists, who wanted a strong central government, and the federalists, who favored more power for the states. It was a mess. Amidst this turmoil, a familiar name began to resurface: Santa Anna. At this point, he was living in exile in Cuba, having been ousted from power a couple of years earlier. To many, he was a disgraced figure, the man who lost Texas. But to others, especially in the army, he was still seen as Mexico's most experienced and charismatic military leader, the only one who could possibly unite the country and stand up to the American invasion. The Federalists, who had been sent on as political rivals for years, saw an opportunity. They figured that if they could bring him back, he could rally the army and overthrow the centralist government of Paris. It was a classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They began plotting his return, hoping he would restore the more liberal Federalist Constitution of 1824 and lead the war effort. Now, here's where the story takes a truly wild turn. Santa Anna needed to get from Cuba back to Mexico. The problem: the U.S. Navy had a blockade on all Mexican ports. How could he possibly slip through? Well, he didn't slip through. He talked his way through. In a masterstroke of political maneuvering, Santa Anna sent a secret envoy to meet with U.S. President James K. Polk. The message was simple but audacious: let me pass through your blockade, and I will return to Mexico, take power, and negotiate a peace treaty favorable to the United States. He promised he would sell California and the New Mexico territory for a reasonable price, ending the war quickly. He was essentially telling the Americans he would sell them the very land they were fighting for. Polk, despite being wary of Santa Anna's reputation for being untrustworthy, decided to take the gamble. He saw it as a potential shortcut to victory. So, he issued secret orders to Commodore David Connor, the commander of the U.S. naval blockade. The orders were to let a certain ship carrying a certain exiled general pass through unhindered. In August 1846, Santa Anna, the man who had fought the U.S. at the Alamo, and San Jacinto sailed right through the American blockade with a U.S. presidential seal of approval. It's one of the most ironic and bizarre episodes of the entire war. Upon landing in Veracruz, Santa Anna was greeted as a hero. He immediately played to the crowd, renouncing any personal ambition for the presidency. He declared his only goal was to serve his country as a soldier and drive out the foreign invaders. He publicly endorsed the Federalist plan to restore the Constitution of 1824, winning their support. With the Federalists and a large part of the army behind him, the government of President Paradis crumbled without a fight. By September, Santa Anna was back in Mexico City, and by December, Congress had officially named him President and Commander-in-Chief of the Army. Who's like that? The Napoleon of the West was back at the helm. But what about his secret deal with the Americans? Well, once in power, Santa Anna conveniently forgot all about it. Instead of negotiating a quick peace, he did the exact opposite. He used his incredible energy and charisma to rally the nation for war. He declared that Mexico would never surrender its territory and would fight to the last man. He had played both sides, the Mexican Federalists and the U.S. government, and came out on top. His immediate challenge was immense. The country was broke. How do you fund a war with no money? Santa Anna turned to the one institution that still had wealth: the Catholic Church. He pushed for a controversial law that would allow the government to seize and sell church property to finance the army. This move was deeply unpopular and led to widespread protests and even armed rebellions, most notably the Revolt of the Polcos in Mexico City. So, while trying to fight the Americans, Santa Anna was also dealing with a civil war at home. Despite the internal chaos, Santa Anna managed to scrape together a surprisingly large and motivated army. He imposed forced loans, conscripted soldiers, and used his own personal wealth and influence to equip his troops. Within a few months, he had assembled an army of nearly 20,000 men in San Luis Potosí, ready to march north and confront the American forces under General Zachary Taylor. This was Santa Anna in his element: the ambitious general, the master organizer, the charismatic leader defying impossible odds. He was a complex figure, driven by a mix of genuine patriotism and boundless personal ambition. He saw the war as his ultimate chance for redemption, a way to erase the shame of losing Texas and restore his legacy as Mexico's savior. He believed he could outsmart and outfight the Americans. He saw their army as small and overextended, and he planned to crush Taylor's forces in the north before turning his attention to any potential threats coming from the coast. His strategy was bold and aggressive. So, as 1846 came to a close, the stage was set for a major clash. Santa Anna, having returned from exile through a deal with the enemy he now vowed to destroy, was marching north at the head of a massive army. The Americans, who had expected a quick and easy negotiation, were now facing a re-energized and determined enemy led by their most formidable general. The war was about to enter its bloodiest and most decisive phase. Santa Anna's return completely changed the dynamic of the conflict. It ensured that the war would be a long, hard-fought struggle, not the simple land grab some in Washington had hoped for. In our next chapter, we'll see what happens when Santa Anna's newly formed army meets Zachary Taylor's forces at the epic Battle of Buena Vista. It's a battle that will test the limits of both commanders and their men. Thanks for watching, and be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next part of our story. See you then. Hello, and welcome back to our quiet corner of history. Settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift back in time as we continue our story. Tonight, we journey to the heart of Mexico, to the final, dramatic moments of a long and arduous campaign. This is Chapter 13, the battle for the capital. After the victory at Puebla, General Winfield Scott and his American army faced their ultimate objective, Mexico City, but the path was anything but clear. The city was a natural fortress, surrounded by marshes, lakes, and fortified causeways. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, having rallied his forces, had prepared a formidable defense, believing he could trap the invaders and destroy them. Scott's army numbered around 11,000 men, significantly outnumbered by the Mexican defenders, who held strong positions along the main roads leading into the capital. A direct assault would be catastrophic. Scott, ever the strategist, knew he had to find another way. He sent his brilliant engineering officer, Captain Robert E. Lee, to scout the difficult terrain to the south. The terrain was a nightmarish landscape of volcanic rock, called the Pedro, deemed impassable by Santa Anna. But Lee and his engineers found a way. Under the cover of darkness and a torrential downpour, they painstakingly carved a mule path through the treacherous rock field. This audacious move allowed a large portion of Scotty's army to bypass Santa Anna's main defenses to the east and emerge unexpectedly on the Mexican Army's flank. The first major engagement of this final phase began at dawn on August 20th, 1847, near the village of Contreras. The Americans, having completed their grueling march through the launched a surprise attack on a detached Mexican force under General Valencia. The battle was swift and decisive. In just 17 minutes, the Mexican lines crumbled. The victory at Contreras was a huge morale booster and a strategic master. It not only opened a new, unexpected route to the city, but also captured vital artillery and supplies. With the Mexican flank turned, Santa Anna was forced to pull his troops back to a new defensive line. The next obstacle was the formidable convent fortress at Churubusco. The ancient stone monastery had been converted into a powerful bastion, its thick walls bristling with cannons. Just a few hours after Contreras, the American forces, flushed with victory, pushed forward. The assault on Churubusco was brutal. Wave after wave of American soldiers charged across open ground, facing withering fire from the determined defenders. The Mexican soldiers, particularly the St. Patrick's Battalion, the San Patricios, fought with incredible bravery and desperation. They knew capture meant execution as deserters from the U.S. Army. For hours, the battle raged. The convent walls held firm, and American casualties mounted. The turning point came not at the convent itself, but at a nearby bridgehead. A fierce fight for control of the bridge eventually saw the American forces break through, threatening to encircle the monastery. With their ammunition nearly exhausted and their position untenable, the defenders of Churubusco were finally forced to surrender. The white flag was raised, but according to legend, General Pedro Anaya, when asked by an American officer to surrender the ammunition, defiantly replied, "If I had any ammunition, you would not be here." The day had been incredibly costly for both sides, but in a single day of fighting, Scott's army had won 2 major battles and stood at the very gates of Mexico City. An armistice was called, a brief pause for negotiations. Scott hoped that the victories would be enough to bring about a peace treaty. But the talks failed. Santa Anna used the time to strengthen the city's final defenses, and Scott knew he had no choice but to resume the attack. The next target was a cluster of stone buildings known as Molino del Rey, the King's Mill. Scott's intelligence suggested, incorrectly, that the mills were being used to cast cannons for the city's defense. He ordered an assault for the early morning of September 8th. He believed it would be a small skirmish to destroy the supposed foundry. He was wrong. The Battle of Molino del Rey turned into one of the bloodiest engagements of the war. The Mexican forces were well entrenched and fought with fierce determination. The Americans advanced into a slaughterhouse. They took the mills, were driven out by a ferocious counterattack, and then had to retake them in a desperate, close-quarters struggle. The fighting was hand-to-hand, vicious and costly. By the time the Americans secured the position, they found no evidence of killing. The victory was a tactical one, but it came at a staggering price in casualties, shaking the morale of the American army. Now, only one major fortification stood between Scott's army and the heart of Mexico City. The mighty fortress of Chapultepec, perched atop a 200-foot hill. Chapultepec Castle was not only a military bastion, but also Mexico's national military academy. It was a symbol of national pride. Its slopes were steep, and its walls were strong. Defending the castle were veteran soldiers and the young cadets of the Academy de Niños Héroes, or hero children. Scott planned a 2-day operation. On September 12th, his artillery began a relentless, day-long bombardment of the castle, hoping to soften its defenses and demoralize its defenders. The shells rained down, shaking the ancient structure to its foundations. Then, on the morning of September 13th, the infantry assault began. American troops charged up the steep slopes from multiple directions, carrying scaling ladders. The defenders, though battered by the artillery, met them with a storm of musket and cannon fire. Ladders were thrown down, and attackers fell, but more pressed forward. The fight for the walls was desperate. Slowly, painstakingly, the Americans gained a foothold on the ramparts. The battle surged into the castle itself, a chaotic melee in the courtyards and rooms. It was here that the legend of the Niños Heroes was born. The young cadets, some as young as 13, refused to retreat. They fought to the last, defending their school and their nation's honor. The last of them, Juan Escucha, is said to have wrapped himself in the Mexican flag and leaped from the castle walls to prevent the flag from being captured. With Chapultepec taken, the battle was not quite over. The Americans had to fight their way down the 2 long causeways leading into the city proper. These narrow roads were swept by defenders firing from buildings and barricades. Every foot was contested, but the momentum was unstoppable. By nightfall, General Scott's weary but triumphant soldiers had breached the city gates. That night, Santa Anna and what remained of his government and army evacuated Mexico City. On the morning of September 14th, 1847, the stars and stripes were raised over the National Palace in the Zócalo, the city's main square. The battle for the capital was over. The long, difficult campaign that had begun on the banks of the Rio Grande had reached its conclusion in the halls of Montezuma. The fall of Mexico City effectively ended the war. Though the human cost was immense, the strategic brilliance, engineering audacity, and sheer grit displayed in those final weeks had carried an outnumbered American army to a stunning and decisive victory. And so, as the flag waves over the silent city, our chapter 4 tonight comes to a close. Let the echoes of Contreras, the valor of Churubusco, the sacrifice at Molino del Rey, and the heroism of Chapultepec fade into the quiet of the night. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope you'll come back for our next chapter. Until then, sleep well. September 14th, 1847. The air over Mexico City is thick, not with the usual morning haze, but with the heavy silence of surrender. The relentless cannonades that have shaken the valley for days have finally ceased. A new sound begins to emerge, the rhythmic, steady tramp of thousands of boots on stone pavement. These are the sounds of General Winfield Scott's army, marching into the heart of a fallen capital. Imagine the scene. Just yesterday, these same streets were scenes of chaotic, desperate battle. At the Belan and San Cosam gates, Mexican soldiers and citizen militias fought with ferocious bravery, turning every archway and rooftop into a fortress. The fighting was street by street, house by house, a brutal, close-quarters struggle for every inch of their beloved city. But the weight of the American advance, the sheer force of their artillery, proved overwhelming. The defenders were pushed back, their lines broken, their ammunition spent. Now, as the first American columns advance, the city they enter is a ghost of its former self. The grand boulevards are eerily empty. The ornate balconies, usually bustling with life, are vacant, their iron railings scarred by musket balls. The vibrant markets are silent, their stalls overturned. Abandoned barricades, hastily constructed from furniture, cobblestones, and carts, stand as silent monuments to the futile resistance. These are not the spoils of a triumphant entry, but the somber artifacts of a city's agony. The American soldiers, weary and blood-stained, march with a mixture of exhaustion and awe. 4 months, the halls of Montezuma had been their rallying cry, a near mythical objective at the end of a long and brutal campaign. Now, they passed magnificent churches, their stone facades pockmarked by cannon fire. They see plazas deserted, save for a few stray dogs and the debris of battle. The air smells of gunpowder and dust. There are no cheering crowds, no waving flags of surrender, only shuttered windows and an unnerving stillness. It feels less like a victory parade and more like a funeral procession. Leading the way is General Scott, a towering, imposing figure on horseback. He rides not with flamboyant triumph, but with a grim, stoic expression. He understands the weight of this moment. Capturing the enemy's capital is a decisive blow, the symbolic climax of the war. But he also sees the cost etched into the very stones of the city around him. He knows that occupying a city of over 150,000 resentful inhabitants will be a new kind of battle. The destination for the lead column is the Zocalo, the Grand Central Plaza, the political and cultural heart of Mexico. As the soldiers emerge into this vast, open square, the scale of their achievements sinks in. Before them stands the magnificent Metropolitan Cathedral, a testament to centuries of history. To their right is the National Palace, the seat of Mexican power, the legendary halls of Montezuma. This is the moment that will be immortalized in paintings and histories. An American officer, Captain Benjamin Roberts of the Mounted Rifles, climbs to the roof of the National Palace. He lowers the Mexican tricolor, the flag that has flown here since the nation's independence. In its place, he raises the stars and stripes. As the American flag catches the breeze and unfurls against the Mexican sky, a ragged cheer goes up from the troops below. It's a sound that's quickly swallowed by the immense, silent plaza. For the soldiers, it is a moment of profound relief and pride. They have marched over 250 miles from the coast, fought and won a half-dozen major battles against superior numbers, and endured disease, heat, and relentless hardship. They have accomplished what many thought was impossible. They have taken the enemy's capital. But for the citizens of Mexico City, peering from behind closed curtains, the sight of that foreign flag flying over their palace is a moment of ultimate humiliation and despair. Their nation's honor feels violated, their sovereignty broken. The war, for all intents and purposes, is lost. The quiet of the city is the quiet of shock and grief. However, this quiet is deceptive. It masks a simmering rage that is about to boil over. The formal surrender of the city's government does not mean the surrender of its people. As the American forces begin to disperse, setting up headquarters, and trying to establish order, the city starts to fight back in a different way. Suddenly, a shot rings out from a rooftop. Then, an order. From alleyways and windows, hidden figure sliperos, the urban poor, alongside disbanded soldiers and furious citizens, begin to open fire on the occupying troops. Rocks and debris rain down from above. The quiet occupation erupts into a vicious, citywide guerrilla war. The American soldiers, who thought the fighting was over, are caught by surprise. What was meant to be the end of the war becomes a new, terrifying chapter. The next 2 days will see brutal street fighting as the Americans struggle to suppress the uprising. They are forced to blast their way into houses, dragging snipers out into the streets. The battle for Mexico City is not over. It has just become more personal, more desperate, and more cruel. This chaotic and bloody aftermath complicates the simple narrative of victory. The fall of Mexico City was not a clean, decisive event. It was a messy, tragic, and deeply symbolic moment. It marked the military culmination of the U.S. campaign, but also sowed the seeds of a long and bitter resentment. The raising of the American flag over the National Palace was the symbolic end of the Mexican-American War. It forced the Mexican government to the negotiating table and led directly to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which would cede vast territories including modern-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and more to the United States. The consequences of this day would reshape the map of North America forever. But here, on the ground, on September 14, 1847, those grand geopolitical shifts are distant concerns. The reality is the echoing gunfire in the streets, the smell of smoke, the fear in the eyes of both the conqueror and the conquered. It is the story of a grand capital brought to its knees, but refusing to be completely broken, a city silenced, but whose spirit of defiance still echoes in the labyrinth of its streets. The fall of Mexico City was not just the end of a war. It was the traumatic birth of a new and complicated relationship between two neighboring nations, a moment whose legacy we are still grappling with today. Thank you for watching. If you found this glimpse into history compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories from the past. Your support helps us continue to bring these pivotal moments to life. We'll see you in the next chapter. Welcome back to our series on the Mexican-American War. Today, we're diving into Chapter 15. Diplomacy in the Shadows. While battles raged across Mexico, another, quieter war was being fought. A war of words, of wills, and of clandestine meetings held under the cloak of night. This is the story of the treaty that almost wasn't, and the stubborn diplomat who refused to give up on peace. Our story's main character isn't a general or a soldier, but a clerk from the State Department named Nicholas Trist. Trist was President James K. Polk's man on the ground, sent to Mexico with a single, crucial mission: to negotiate a peace treaty as soon as an opportunity arose. He was married to Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter, a fact that gave him a certain pedigree. But in the world of high-stakes diplomacy and military command, he was largely seen as an outsider. When Trist arrived in Mexico, he immediately clashed with the commanding general of the American forces. Winfield Scott, a proud and seasoned military man, saw Trist as a civilian meddler, an unqualified clerk sent by the president to interfere in his campaign. Their initial interactions were hilariously petty. They exchanged a series of increasingly hostile letters, arguing over protocol, authority, and even the proper way to seal an envelope. For weeks, the two most important Americans in Mexico weren't even on speaking terms, a situation that threatened to derail any chance for peace before it even began. But as the war dragged on, something shifted. Scott, seeing the brutal cost of the fighting and the difficulty of subduing the entire country, began to realize that a negotiated peace was the only viable path forward. He and Trist eventually reconciled, their shared desire for an end to the bloodshed overcoming their personal animosity. They became unlikely allies, working together to open a channel to the fractured Mexican government. The political situation in Mexico City was pure chaos. Governments rose and fell with alarming speed. Santa Anna, the ever-present figure in Mexican politics, was in power one day and a fugitive the next. Negotiating with anyone was like trying to grab smoke. Who had the authority to make a deal? Who could guarantee that any treaty signed would be honored by the next faction to seize power? This was the treacherous landscape Trist had to navigate. His opportunity came after the fall of Mexico City. With the capital in American hands, a moderate faction of Mexican politicians saw the writing on the wall. They knew that continued resistance was futile and would only lead to more destruction and potentially the complete loss of their country. Secretly, they reached out. This is where the diplomacy in the shadows truly begins. Imagine the scene. The war-torn city is under military occupation. The nights are dark, tense, and filled with uncertainty. In quiet, back rooms of haciendas, lit only by the soft, flickering glow of oil lamps, Nicholas Trist met with Mexican commissioners. These weren't grand, formal state meetings. They were clandestine, risky encounters. The Mexican officials who dared to negotiate with the enemy were branded as traitors, or pulcos, by hardliners who wanted to fight to the last man. Their lives were in very real danger. The negotiations were painstaking. Every article, every clause, every square mile of territory was a point of contention. The key issues were the border and the payment. Trist was authorized to offer a significant sum of money, not as a purchase in the traditional sense, but as a way for the Mexican government to save face and to compensate for the vast territory being ceded what is now California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of other states. The Rio Grande was to be the border of Texas. For the Mexican negotiators, this was a moment of profound national trauma. They were being forced to sign away nearly half of their country's territory. They argued, they pleaded, they tried to salvage what they could. Trist, though firm on his government's core demands, showed a surprising degree of empathy. He understood the humiliation they felt and worked to make the terms as palatable as possible under the circumstances. Just as they were on the brink of a breakthrough, a bombshell arrived from Washington. President Polk, frustrated by the slow pace of negotiations and the perceived defiance of Santa Anna's earlier government, had lost his patience. He had sent a dispatch recalling Trist immediately. His orders were clear: terminate all negotiations and return to Washington. The policy had changed. The U.S. would now simply occupy the territory it wanted and wait for a Mexican government to sue for peace. On American terms, this was Trist's moment of truth. He was a bureaucrat, a man who had built his career on following orders. His instructions were direct and unambiguous, but on the ground, he saw a reality that poked thousands of miles away could not. He had a deal within his grasp. The moderate Mexican government he was negotiating with was fragile. If he walked away, they would likely collapse, replaced by hardliners who would never agree to a treaty. The window for peace would slam shut, leading to a prolonged, bloody occupation, costing countless more lives on both sides. In an extraordinary act of defiance, Nicholas Trist decided to disobey a direct order from the President of the United States. He wrote a lengthy, 65-page letter back to Washington explaining his decision. He essentially told the president that he was firing him. Trist declared that he was going to finish the negotiations, presenting the administration with a signed treaty as a fait accompli. It was an incredible gamble. He was acting completely without authority, risking his career, his reputation, and potential prosecution. He called it a moment where he had to choose between his duty to his government and his duty to God and mankind. With the clock ticking, Trist and the Mexican commissioners raced to finalize the treaty. On February 2nd, 1848, in the small town of Guadalupe Hidalgo, just outside Mexico City, the document was signed. The war was officially over. Trist, now just a private citizen with no official standing, had single-handedly negotiated the end of the conflict. He sent the treaty to Washington with a courier and prepared for the consequences. When the treaty arrived, President Polk was furious at Trist's insubordination, but he was also a pragmatist. The treaty gave him everything he had wanted from the start. He was facing growing opposition to the war at home, and the treaty was his exit strategy. Reluctantly, Polk submitted the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to the Senate. After a fierce debate, it was ratified. Nicholas Trist returned to the United States, not as a hero, but in disgrace. He was unceremoniously fired from his job at the State Department. The Polk administration even refused to pay him for his salary and expenses. During his unauthorized time in Mexico, he faded into obscurity and financial hardship for years, a forgotten figure who had secured one of the most significant territorial expansions in American history. It wasn't until 2 decades later, under President Ulysses S. Grant, that his name was finally cleared and he was paid what he was owed. Trist's story is a powerful reminder that history is often made not just by generals on the battlefield, but by individuals in quiet rooms, making difficult, courageous choices. His defiance of orders, his belief in the possibility of peace, and his willingness to risk everything for it, changed the course of two nations. The shadows of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave birth to the modern American West. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. Say you then. Welcome back to our series on the defining moments of American history. Today, we're stepping into the year 1848, a time of immense change and consequence. The guns of the Mexican-American War have fallen silent, but the future of two nations hangs in the balance. In a small town just north of Mexico City, a document is being prepared that will not just end a war but redraw the map of North America and set the United States on a new and often turbulent course. This is the story of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. To truly understand the weight of this treaty, we have to rewind a bit. The war, which began in 1846, was fueled by the American concept of manifest destinita, belief that the nation was divinely ordained to expand across the continent. It was also driven by a bitter dispute over the border of the newly annexed state of Texas. Mexico claimed the Nueces River as the boundary, while the United States and Texas insisted it was the Rio Grande, much further south. This disagreement, combined with American ambitions for California and the Southwest, created an explosive situation that finally erupted into open conflict. For nearly 2 years, the war raged. American forces, led by generals like Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, pushed deep into Mexican territory. They fought battles in places that would become legendary, from Palo Alto to Buena Vista, and ultimately, they captured the capital, Mexico City, in September of 1847. The fighting was over, but the difficult task of making peace had just begun. The fall of Mexico City plunged the Mexican government into chaos, making negotiations incredibly difficult. For a time, it was unclear if there was even a stable government left to negotiate with. Enter Nicholas Trist, a name not always remembered in the grand sweep of history, but a man who played a crucial role at this critical juncture. Trist was the chief clerk of the U.S. State Department, sent by President James K. Polk to negotiate a peace treaty. However, his mission was a roller coaster. At one point, frustrated with the lack of progress and political infighting, President Polk actually recalled Trist, ordering him to return to Washington. But Trist, seeing a small window of opportunity with a newly formed, moderate government in Mexico, made a daring decision. He disobeyed the president. He believed that if he left, the chance for peace might be lost forever, possibly leading to a prolonged, devastating guerrilla war or even the total annexation of Mexico, something many in the U.S. opposed. So, on February 2nd, 1848, in the town of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Nicholas Trist and the Mexican representatives put their signatures on the treaty that would bear the town's name. It was not a moment of joyous celebration, but one of solemnity and reflection. For Mexico, it was a moment of profound loss, the result of a devastating war on their home soil. For the United States, it was the realization of a continental ambition, but one that came at a significant cost in blood and treasure, and one that would ignite fierce internal debates. Let's break down the key terms of the treaty, because they are monumental. First, the border dispute that started it all was settled. Mexico officially recognized the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. This alone was a major concession. But the next part is what truly transformed the United States. Mexico ceded a vast expanse of its northern territory, an area known as the Mexican Cession. Think about the map of the American West today. This single transaction handed over the lands that would become the states of California, Nevada, and Utah. It also included most of Arizona, a large portion of New Mexico, and parts of what are now Colorado and Wyoming. This was a staggering amount of land, over 525,000 square miles. It increased the size of the United States by nearly a third. The dream of a nation stretching from sea to shining sea was now a reality. From the Atlantic shores to the Pacific coast, it was all under the American flag. This wasn't a gift, however. In exchange for this territory, the United States agreed to pay Mexico a sum of $15 million. To put that in perspective, that's about $500 million in today's money. The U.S. also agreed to assume about $3.25 million in debts that the Mexican government owed to American citizens. Some historians view this payment as a form of conscience money, an attempt to legitimize the acquisition and frame it as a purchase rather than a conquest. It was significantly less than what the U.S. had offered for the territory before the war, but it was a crucial part of getting the treaty ratified. It allowed the Polk administration to present the deal to Congress not as a naked land grab, but as a formal, legal transaction between two sovereign nations, however unequal their bargaining positions were at the time. The treaty also had profound implications for the people living in these newly acquired territories. It promised that the Mexican citizens who chose to remain in it, there were tens of thousands of them, could either retain their Mexican citizenship or become citizens of the United States. It also promised to protect their property rights and religious freedoms. These promises were, unfortunately, often poorly enforced or outright ignored in the decades that followed, leading to displacement and the loss of land for many of the region's longtime Hispanic inhabitants. This legacy of broken promises is a critical and often overlooked part of the treaty's story. Back in Washington, D.C., the treaty's arrival was met with a mixed reception. President Polk was furious that Trist had defied his recall order. However, he also recognized that Trist had secured a deal that aligned almost perfectly with his original war aims. He couldn't really reject it. But in Congress, the debate was fierce. Some expansionists, known as All Mexico proponents, were disappointed. They wanted the U.S. to annex the entire country of Mexico, not just its northern territories. On the other side, anti-slavery Whigs, like a young Abraham Lincoln, had opposed the war from the start, viewing it as an immoral conflict designed to expand the territory and political power of slave-holding states. The central, unavoidable issue was slavery. Every square mile of this new territory became a flashpoint in the growing sectional crisis. Would these new lands be free or slave? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had drawn a line across the country, but this new territory threw all previous arrangements into question. The debate over the Wilmette Proviso, which sought to ban slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico, had already fractured Congress along north-south lines. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo poured fuel on this fire, making the question of slavery's expansion an immediate and unavoidable national crisis. Despite the controversy, on March 10, 1848, the U.S. Senate ratified the treaty by a vote of 38-14, just 4 votes over the required 2/3 majority. The war was officially over. But in many ways, the treaty didn't end a conflict so much as it started a new, won-the-bitter, 10-year political battle that would lead directly to the American Civil War. The vast lands acquired from Mexico would become the battlegrounds for the arguments over slavery that would ultimately tear the nation apart. So, when we look at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we see more than just a peace agreement. We see the dramatic fulfillment of manifest destiny. We see the creation of the modern American West. We see a solemn moment of negotiation that reshaped a continent. But we also see the seeds of a future conflict, a treaty that solved one war only to set the stage for a much larger, bloodier one. It is a powerful reminder that the closing of one chapter of history is often the opening of another. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a pivotal moment. The consequences of this treaty are still felt today in the culture, demographics, and politics of the American Southwest. If you found this video informative, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Have you ever looked at a map of the United States and just ... marveled at its size? From the Atlantic to the Pacific, it's this vast, unbroken stretch of land. But it wasn't always this way. In fact, for a long time, the idea of a coast-to-coast nation was little more than a fantasy. Then, in what felt like the blink of an eye, everything changed. This is the story of how a continent was transformed, almost overnight. Imagine it's the early 1800s. The United States is a young, ambitious country, but it's mostly confined to the East Coast. The western border is the mighty Mississippi River. Beyond that lies a world of mystery, French territory, Spanish claims, and vast unmapped lands inhabited by hundreds of indigenous nations for millennia. To most Americans, the West was a blank space on the map, a place of legends and rumors. Then came the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, with a single signature. President Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the country. Suddenly, The United States stretched into the heart of the continent. But what was actually out there? That's where Lewis and Clark came in. Their incredible journey from 1804 to 1806 was more than just an expedition. It was the first real glimpse into this new American empire. They brought back stories of towering mountains, endless prairies, teeming with bison, and rivers that carved through the land like arteries. They described a landscape so grand, so immense, it was hard for people back east to even comprehend. But the real explosion of growth, the moment the map truly shattered its old boundaries, happened in the 1840s. This decade was a whirlwind of expansion, fueled by an idea called manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to stretch from sea to shining sea. It was a powerful and often controversial idea that drove the nation westward with an unstoppable force. First came Texas. After declaring independence from Mexico, the Republic of Texas was annexed by the United States in 1845. This single act added a massive piece of territory, but it also lit the fuse for conflict. The annexation led directly to the Mexican-American War, a conflict that would fundamentally redraw the map of North America. The war, which lasted from 1846 to 1848, was a decisive victory for the United States. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war, was one of the most significant land transfers in history. Mexico ceded a vast region that we now know as the American Southwest. We're talking about all of California, Nevada, and Utah, plus parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. Who's like that? The United States had a Pacific coastline. The dream of a continent-spanning nation was no longer a dream. It was a reality. At the same time, another piece of the puzzle fell into place way up in the Pacific Northwest. For years, the United States and Great Britain had jointly occupied the Oregon Territory, a huge area that included present-day Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of Montana and Wyoming. Tensions rose, with American settlers shouting the slogan 5440 or fight, referring to the latitude line they wanted as the northern border. Eventually, in 1846, diplomacy won out. The Oregon Treaty was signed, establishing the border at the 49th parallel, where it remains today. So, let's pause and take a breath. In less than 5 years, from 1845 to 1848, the United States had acquired Texas, the Oregon Territory, and the entire Southwest. The landmass of the country increased by over a third. The map didn't just expand, it was completely and irrevocably transformed. But what were these new lands actually like? This wasn't just more of the same rolling hills and forests of the East. This was a whole new world. Imagine being one of the first American settlers to see it. You would have crossed the Great Plains, a sea of grass so vast it seemed to swallow the sky, where herds of bison numbered in the millions. Then, rising like a jagged wall from the plains, you'd encounter the Rocky Mountains. Not just a few hills, but a colossal spine of stone and ice stretching for thousands of miles. Peaks that clawed at the clouds, deep canyons carved by ancient rivers, and dense forests of pine and fir that seemed to go on forever. This was a formidable barrier, a true test of courage and endurance for anyone heading west. If you made it through the Rockies, you might find yourself in the Great Basin, a high-altitude desert of sagebrush and salt flats, a land of extreme temperatures, where water is more precious than gold. It's a landscape of stark, minimalist beauty, where the silence is so profound you can almost hear the ringing in your own ears. And then, finally, after a journey that could take months, you would cross the Sierra Nevada and descend into California. And what a paradise it seemed. Fertile valleys perfect for farming, a mild climate, and a coastline that stretched for hundreds of miles along the deep blue Pacific Ocean. It was the ultimate prize, the western anchor of the new American continent. This sudden acquisition of land had profound consequences. For one, it unleashed an unprecedented wave of migration. The Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, these weren't just lines on a map. They were lifelines and graveyards for hundreds of thousands of people seeking a new life. They were farmers looking for fertile soil, merchants seeking new markets, and families simply hoping for a fresh start. And then, in 1848, just days after the treaty with Mexico was signed, Gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California. The news spread like wildfire, and the gold rush began. It was a global phenomenon. People came from all over the world, not just from the eastern United States, but from Europe, Latin America, and even China, all chasing the dream of instant wealth. San Francisco transformed from a sleepy village into a bustling, chaotic boomtown almost overnight. The gold rush accelerated the settlement of the West at a pace no one could have predicted. It created immense wealth, but it also brought lawlessness, environmental destruction, and terrible violence, particularly against the indigenous peoples of California, whose lives were shattered by the influx of miners. And that's the crucial, often tragic, side of this story. This continent wasn't empty. It was home to vibrant and diverse Native American cultures that had existed for thousands of years. The rapid expansion of the United States was a catastrophe for them. Treaties were made and broken, lands were seized, and ways of life were systematically destroyed. The story of the taming of the West is also the story of the conquest and displacement of its original inhabitants. So, when we look at that map of the United States, it's important to remember how it got that way. It wasn't a slow, gentle process. It was a rapid, dramatic, and often violent transformation. In a very short period, the political and physical geography of North America was redefined. The acquisition of these new lands, the mountains, the deserts, the coastlines didn't just change the map. It changed the very idea of what America was and what it could be. It set the stage for the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, and the rise of the United States as a global power. The continent was transformed, and in the process, so was the nation itself. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this journey through history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about how our world came to be. See you next time. The treaty was signed, the ink was dry, and the Mexican-American War was officially over. But for the people living through its aftermath, the story was just beginning. On one side of the newly drawn border, church bells rang out in celebration. In the United States, the victory was hailed as a triumph of manifest destiny. Newspapers were filled with bold headlines, proclaiming a glorious expansion from sea to shining sea. Parades snaked through city streets, with cheering crowds waving flags and celebrating the soldiers returning home. For many Americans, it felt like the dawn of a new era, a confirmation of their nation's power and divine purpose. The acquisition of vast territories like California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and more promised untold riches and limitless opportunities. Gold had just been discovered in California, adding a feverish excitement to the national mood. It was a time of immense optimism and national pride, a belief that the country was marching confidently into a golden age. But on the other side of that new border, the mood was starkly different. There were no celebrations in Mexico City, only a profound and somber silence. The loss was devastating. The nation had been forced to cede over half of its territory lands that had been part of Mexico since its independence from Spain. This wasn't just a loss of land. It was a deep wound to the national soul. Political leaders were disgraced, the military was humbled, and the public was left grappling with a sense of betrayal and despair. How could this have happened? The feeling was one of profound mourning for a future that had been stolen. Families were torn apart by the new border, and a deep-seated resentment toward their northern neighbor began to take root, one that would shape the relationship between the two countries for generations to come. The loss became a defining moment in Mexican history, a painful memory of vulnerability and foreign aggression that is still discussed and remembered to this day. And what about the people who didn't identify as American or Mexican, yet whose lives were irrevocably changed? The vast, newly acquired territories were not empty. For centuries, they had been home to hundreds of distinct Native American nations: the Apache, the Navajo, the Ute, the Pueblo peoples, and many others had their own complex societies, trade networks, and deep spiritual connections to the land. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed without their consent, without their input, without even their consideration. For them, the end of the war didn't bring peace. It brought a new and powerful colonizing force directly to their doorstep. Suddenly, they were living in a country called the United States, subject to its laws and its relentless push for expansion. Their ancestral lands, sacred sites, and traditional ways of life were now under immense threat. The conflict between Mexico and the United States was over, but for the original inhabitants of the Southwest, a new and even more desperate struggle for survival was just beginning. They faced a future filled with uncertainty, broken promises, and the looming shadow of displacement. Their voices, often lost in the grand narratives of national triumph and defeat, tell a crucial part of this story, a story of resilience in the face of overwhelming change. So, when we look back at the end of the Mexican-American War, it's essential to see it not as a single event, but as a fractured and complex moment experienced in vastly different ways. For the United States, it was a moment of triumphant expansion, a perceived fulfillment of destiny that propelled the nation toward becoming a continental power. The narrative was one of progress, opportunity, and limitless horizons. The newly acquired lands fueled economic growth and westward migration, shaping the American identity for the next century. But this celebration came at a tremendous cost. For Mexico, it was a period of national trauma and introspection, a painful amputation that left lasting scars on the country's psyche and its relationship with its powerful neighbor. The loss forced a difficult reckoning with its own internal weaknesses and its place in the world. And for the native peoples caught in the middle, it was the beginning of a new and devastating chapter of colonization. Their sovereignty was ignored, their lands were taken, and they were forced to navigate a new political reality that saw them as obstacles to be removed. By listening to all these voices, the cheers of the victor, the laments of the vanquished, and the quiet warnings of those who were there long before, we get a much richer, more complete, and more honest understanding of this pivotal moment in North American history. It reminds us that history is never a single story, but a chorus of many different experiences, each one deserving to be heard. Thanks for watching. If you found this chapter insightful, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the stories that have shaped our world. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through the American story. Today, we're diving into chapter 19, a chapter that glitters with promise and echoes with the shouts of gold. We're talking about the California Gold Rush, a moment in history that didn't just change a territory. It redefined the American dream and accelerated the nation's westward expansion at a breathtaking pace. The story begins in a place that was, until recently, part of Mexico. On February 2nd, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, officially ending the Mexican-American War. With the stroke of a pen, a vast expanse of land, including California, was ceded to the United States. It was a monumental shift in the geopolitical landscape. But what no one at that treaty table knew was that an even more monumental discovery had been made just 9 days earlier. Imagine this: a quiet, remote valley along the American River in Coloma, California. John Sutter, a Swiss immigrant with grand plans for an agricultural empire, had hired a carpenter named James W. Marshall to build a sawmill. The mill was nearly complete, but the channel, or tail race, that was supposed to carry water away from the water wheel wasn't deep enough. On the morning of January 24th, 1848, Marshall was inspecting this channel. The water had been shut off overnight, and as the morning sun hit the ditch, something caught his eye. It was a glimmer, a sparkle in the muddy bed of the river. He reached down and picked up a few small, yellowish flakes. They were heavy, much heavier than ordinary rock. He bit one, a common test for gold, and it was soft. Could it be? Could this really be gold? Marshall, a man described as somewhat eccentric and prone to visions, was both excited and skeptical. He gathered his findings and rushed back to Sutter's Fort, a journey of about 50 miles. He arrived drenched from a rainstorm and demanded a private meeting with John Sutter. In Sutter's office, they locked the door and tested the metal. They consulted an encyclopedia, performed a chemical test with nitric acid, and weighed it against silver. The conclusion was undeniable. It was gold. Pure gold. Sutter was horrified, not by the discovery of gold itself, but by what it meant for his vision. He had dreams of a peaceful agricultural utopia, a vast farming enterprise called Nueces. He understood immediately that a gold rush would bring chaos. It would bring thousands of unruly prospectors who would trample his crops, steal his livestock, and overrun his land. He tried to keep the discovery a secret, swearing Marshall and his workers to silence. But a secret like this, a secret worth its weight in gold, was impossible to contain. Word travels fast, especially when it's whispered. The sawmill workers started quietly prospecting in their spare time. A woman who cooked for the men was paid in gold dust, and she used it to buy supplies at a local store. The storekeeper, a shrewd businessman named Sam Brannan, was intrigued. He saw a far greater opportunity than panning for gold himself. He started stocking his store with every pick, shovel, and pan he could find. Then, in May of 1848, Brannan orchestrated one of the most famous marketing stunts in American history. He filled a small bottle with gold dust, ran through the streets of San Francisco, a sleepy port town at the time, and shouted, "Gold, gold, gold, gold from the American river." The town went wild. San Francisco emptied out almost overnight. The blacksmith left his forge. The baker left his oven. The sailors abandoned their ships in the harbor. The gold rush had begun. News traveled slowly back then. It took months for the reports to reach the East Coast, and at first, they were met with disbelief. It sounded like another tall tale from the wild, untamed West. But the stories kept coming, and they were accompanied by tangible proof. Newspapers printed letters from California describing men making fortunes in a matter of days. Then came the official confirmation. In his address to Congress in December 1848, President James K. Polk spoke of the incredible mineral wealth being unearthed in California. He displayed a tea caddy filled with 230 ounces of pure California gold, sending a shockwave across the nation and the world. That was it. The floodgates opened. The 49ers, as they came to be called, began their epic journey west in 1849. They came from every state in the Union and from every corner of the globe. They came from Europe, from China, from Australia, and from Latin America. They were farmers, lawyers, doctors, clerks, and sailors, all united by a single, burning desire to strike it rich. They were gripped by gold fever. The journey itself was a monumental undertaking. Those from the East Coast had three main options, and none of them were easy. The fastest route was by sea, sailing down to Panama, trekking through the dense, disease-ridden jungle, and then catching another ship up the Pacific coast to San Francisco. This journey could take a few months, but it was expensive and fraught with dangers like cholera and malaria. The longest route, but often considered the safest, was the all-sea journey. This involved a grueling voyage of 18,000 miles around the southern tip of South America, Cape Horn. It was a perilous trip that could take up to 8 months, battling storms and enduring monotonous weeks at sea. The third and most iconic route was overland, following the California Trail. This was a trek of over 2,000 miles across deserts and the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains. Families packed their lives into covered wagons, joining vast wagon trains for protection. They faced harsh weather, dwindling supplies, disease, and the constant strain of a journey that tested the limits of human endurance. For those who made it, California was a land of both incredible opportunity and immense hardship. The early days of the gold rush were known as the placer mining phase. This was mining at its most basic. Gold, being dense, had washed down from the mountains over millennia and settled in the gravel and sand of riverbeds. The first prospectors, the 49ers, could literally pull nuggets out of the streams with their bare hands. The most common tool was the simple pan. A miner would scoop up a panful of gravel and water, then swirl it carefully. The lighter sand and gravel would wash over the side, leaving the heavier gold flakes and nuggets behind. It was back-breaking work, performed 4 hours under the scorching California sun, often while standing knee-deep in freezing river water. As the easy-to-reach surface gold was depleted, miners developed more sophisticated techniques. They built rockers or cradles, which were wooden boxers on rockers that could sift through much more gravel than a simple pan. 10 km long tom in the sluice box, long wooden troughs, with riffles on the bottom to trap gold as water washed sediment through them. These methods often required teams of men to operate, and the lone prospector slowly gave way to small groups of partners. The mining camps that sprang up along the rivers were chaotic, lawless places. They had names like Hangtown, Rough and Ready, and Bedbug. They were little more than collections of tents and crude wooden shacks. Life was expensive. A single egg could cost $1, the equivalent of $30 today. Everything was priced for men who might strike it rich tomorrow. Gambling, drinking, and fighting were common pastimes. There was no formal government or law enforcement, so miners often created their own codes of justice, which could be swift and brutal. The social landscape of California was transformed. Before the gold rush, California was a sparsely populated region with about 15,000 non-native residents. The impact on the environment was devastating. Miners diverted rivers, tore up hillsides, and used high-pressure water cannons. In a practice called hydraulic mining, this new technique could level entire mountains, but it also choked rivers with sediment, destroyed farmland, and ruined natural habitats. The pristine landscape that Marshall had seen was scarred forever. The effect on Native American populations was catastrophic. Their lands were overrun, their food sources destroyed, and they were subjected to violence and disease. The gold rush accelerated a tragic chapter of displacement and destruction for the indigenous peoples of California. Despite the hardships and the long odds, the dream of finding gold continued to lure people in. While many returned home with empty pockets, a lucky few did find incredible wealth. And the biggest fortunes weren't necessarily made by the miners themselves, but by the entrepreneurs who supplied them. Men like Sam Brannan, who became California's first millionaire, or Levi Strauss, who invented sturdy denim pants for miners, or the Big Four railroad barons who would later build the Central Pacific Railroad, all built their empires on the back of the gold rush. The gold rush also dramatically accelerated California's path to statehood. The massive population boom created an urgent need for a stable government. In 1850, just 2 years after being acquired from Mexico, California entered the Union as a free state. This admission tipped the delicate balance of power between free and slave states in Congress, further heightening the tensions that would eventually erupt into the Civil War. The gold rush was a whirlwind, a brief but incredibly intense period. By the mid-1850s, the surface gold was mostly gone, and mining had become a corporate, industrial enterprise requiring massive capital investment. The lone prospector with his pan and his dream became a figure of the past, but the legacy of those few glittering years is immeasurable. The gold rush fueled a wave of immigration, created immense wealth that helped finance the Union during the Civil War, and cemented the idea of California as the Golden State, a land of opportunity and new beginnings. It was a chaotic, transformative, and uniquely American event, born from a chance discovery in a riverbed just days after the land itself had become American. It reshaped the West and forever altered the course of the nation. Thank you for joining me for this chapter. I hope you enjoyed this look at the frenzy and fortune of the California Gold Rush. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. Until then, take care. Today, we're diving into a pivotal chapter in American history, one that sets the stage for the nation's most devastating conflict. We're talking about the years leading up to the Civil War, specifically how the dream of westward expansion turned into a nightmare of national division. So, picture this. It's the mid-1840s. The United States is feeling ambitious, fueled by the idea of manifest destiny. This belief that it was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This ambition leads to the Mexican-American War. And by 1848, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the U.S. acquires a massive chunk of land. We're talking about all or parts of modern-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. On the surface, this looks like a huge win, right? More land, more resources, more opportunity. But this victory came with a hidden cost. A question so explosive it would threaten to tear the country apart. What about slavery? See, for decades, a fragile balance had been maintained between the free states in the North and the slave states in the South. This balance was crucial, especially in the Senate, where each state got 2 votes. As long as the number of free and slave states was roughly equal, neither side could dominate the other on a national level. But now, with all this new territory, the question was unavoidable. Would these new lands be free or slave? This wasn't a new debate. Think back to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. When Missouri wanted to join the Union as a slave state, it threatened to upset the balance. The compromise was to admit Missouri as a slave state, but also admit Maine as a free state, and it drew a line across the Louisiana Purchase territory. Slavery was prohibited north of this line, but allowed south of it. It was a temporary fix, a band-aid on a deep wound, but it held for a while. Now, fast forward to 1846. Even before the war with Mexico is over, a congressman from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot introduces a proposal. It's known as the Wilmot Proviso, and it's a bombshell. He proposes that slavery should be banned in ANY territory acquired from Mexico. The proviso passes in the House of Representatives, where the North had more power due to its larger population, but it's repeatedly blocked in the Senate, where the South had equal power. The debate over the Wilmot Proviso was fierce, and it exposed the deep, raw sectionalism that was growing in the country. Northerners, many of whom weren't necessarily abolitionists, but were part of the Free Soil movement, didn't want to compete with unpaid slave labor in the new territories. They wanted the West to be a land of opportunity for free, white farmers. On the other hand, Southerners saw the Wilmot Proviso as a direct attack on their way of life and their economic system. They argued that they had fought and died in the Mexican-American War, just like Northerners, and they should have the right to take their property, which, in their view, included enslaved people into the new territories. They believed the Constitution protected their property rights, and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories. The failure of the Wilmot Proviso meant there was no clear plan. So what happens? Chaos, of course, especially when gold is discovered in California in 1848. The gold rush begins, and within a year, so many people flood into California that it has enough residents to apply for statehood, and the people who are there, by and large, don't want slavery. They draft a state constitution that bans it and apply to join the Union as a free state in 1849. This sends the South into a panic. If California enters as a free state, the balance of power in the Senate will be permanently tipped in favor of the North. Southern leaders start openly talking about secession leaving the Union. The country is on the brink. This is where the political giants of the era step in for one last great debate. Henry Clay, the same guy who engineered the Missouri Compromise, comes out of retirement. He's known as the Great Compromiser, and he proposes a new, massive package of legislation. We call it the Compromise of 1850. It was an all-or-nothing deal with something for everyone. For the North, California would be admitted as a free state, and the slave trade boom, not slavery itself, would be abolished in Washington, D.C. For the South, the remaining territories acquired from Mexico, Utah, and New Mexico, would decide the issue of slavery for themselves based on popular sovereignty. This meant the settlers in those territories would vote on whether to allow slavery. But the most controversial part of the compromise, the part that would pour gasoline on the fire, was a new, much stricter Fugitive Slave Act. This law was a huge win for the South. It required all citizens, including those in the North, to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. Federal commissioners were appointed to enforce it, and they were paid more for returning a suspected fugitive than for setting them free. There were no jury trials for the accused, and their testimony was not accepted. The passage of the Compromise of 1850 is a dramatic story in itself. Clay's initial omnibus bill failed. The political heavyweights were deadlocked. It was a younger, scrappier politician from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, who managed to break the bill into smaller pieces and skillfully maneuvered each one through Congress. The compromise passed, and for a moment, it seemed like the crisis was averted. Many people breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the issue of slavery was finally settled. They could not have been more wrong. The Fugitive Slave Act was an absolute disaster. In the North, it was seen as a moral outrage. It forced ordinary citizens to become complicit in the system of slavery. It led to scenes of formerly enslaved people, who had lived in freedom for years, being hunted down, captured, and dragged back to the South. It also put free black Americans at risk, as they could be kidnapped and sold into slavery with very little legal recourse. This law radicalized many Northerners who had previously been indifferent to slavery. It brought the brutality of the system right to their doorsteps. Abolitionist movements gained massive momentum. This is the context in which Harriet Beecher Stowe's monumental novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was published in 1852. The book with its vivid portrayal of the suffering of enslaved people, became an instant bestseller. It humanized the issue for millions and turned public opinion in the North firmly against slavery and the Fugitive Slave Act. In the South, the book was condemned as slanderous lies, further deepening the cultural and ideological divide. So, instead of being the final solution, the Compromise of 1850 was just another temporary fix that made things worse. The idea of popular sovereignty, which sounded democratic in principle, would soon prove to be a recipe for violence when it was applied to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And the Fugitive Slave Act ensured that the moral conflict over slavery would not stay confined to the South. It made it a national crisis. Every attempt to compromise, from the Missouri Compromise to the Compromise of 1850, ultimately failed because they tried to find a middle ground on an issue that had no middle ground. The acquisition of new land didn't create the problem, but it forced the United States to confront the fundamental contradiction it had been living with since its founding. A nation conceived in liberty that practiced slavery. The road from here would lead to Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, the rise of the Republican Party, and ultimately, to the firing on Fort Sumter. The path of civil war was now paved. Thanks so much for watching. This period is incredibly complex, and we've really just scratched the surface. If you found this interesting, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what you think was a compromise ever truly possible. See you in the next video. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into chapter 21, and we're going to explore something that often gets overlooked after the smoke clears and the treaties are signed. The lasting legacies of a war. It's easy to focus on the battles and the heroes, but what happens next? What are the ripples that spread through generations, changing societies and shaping the future in ways no one could have predicted? That's what we're tackling today. We'll look at how a conflict can become a training ground for future leaders, how lines drawn on a map can become permanent fixtures of our world, and how cultures can merge and create something entirely new and vibrant in the aftermath. It's a story not just about endings, but about new beginnings, and the profound, long-term consequences that echo long after the fighting stops. So, let's get started. One of the most fascinating, and perhaps unexpected, legacies of the Mexican-American War is how it served as a crucial training ground for the American Civil War. Think about it, this was the first major conflict for a whole generation of West Point graduates. Young officers like Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, William Tecumseh, Sherman, and Stonewall Jackson all cut their teeth in Mexico. They weren't just learning textbook tactics anymore. They were experiencing the realities of war firsthand. They learned about leading men in battle, about the immense challenges of logistics moving troops and supplies over vast, difficult terrain. They observed the strategies of senior commanders like Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor, seeing what worked and what didn't. Grande himself later wrote extensively about how his experiences in Mexico shaped him as a commander. For instance, Robert E. Lee's brilliant reconnaissance missions during the campaign to capture Mexico City were early signs of the strategic genius he would later display for the Confederacy. These men fought side by side in Mexico, forming bonds and rivalries that would be tested in the most dramatic way possible, just a little over a decade later, when they faced each other across the battlefields of the Civil War. It's a powerful reminder that history is deeply interconnected, and the seeds of one conflict are often sown in the soil of another. Now, let's talk about borders. Before the war, the boundary between the United States and Mexico was, to put it mildly, fluid and hotly disputed. The U.S. claimed the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas, while Mexico insisted it was the Nueces River, further north. This disagreement was, of course, a primary trigger for the war itself. The end of the conflict, formalized by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, didn't just end the fighting. It drew a line in the sand that has largely defined the map of North America ever since. The treaty established the Rio Grande as the official border, and Mexico ceded a vast territory what we now know as the American Southwest, including California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. This wasn't just a small adjustment. It was a massive transfer of land that increased the size of the United States by about 25%. A few years later, The Gadsden Purchase in 1853 finalized the last piece of the puzzle, adding a strip of land in present-day Arizona and New Mexico to facilitate a southern railroad route. This permanent border had enormous consequences. It solidified American control from the Atlantic to the Pacific, fulfilling the vision of manifest destiny. But it also created a new reality for the thousands of Mexican citizens who suddenly found themselves living in a new country, governed by a different language and a different set of laws. The border became a symbol of both connection and division, a line that would shape politics, trade, and human migration for centuries to come. This brings us to one of the most enduring and beautiful legacies of this period, the incredible cultural blending that occurred in the Southwest. When the border moved, it didn't erase the people or their history. Suddenly, a region with deep Hispanic and indigenous roots was incorporated into the United States. This wasn't a simple process of assimilation. It was a complex fusion. Anglo-American settlers moving west brought their language, their legal systems, and their traditions. But they encountered a rich, established culture that had been there for centuries. The result was a unique cultural tapestry that is still vibrant today. You can see it in the architecture, with its blend of adobe and American styles. You can hear it in the language, where Spanish words and phrases are woven into everyday English, and you can definitely taste it in the food. Tex-Mex and Southwestern cuisine are direct results of this cultural mixing, combining ingredients and cooking techniques from Mexican, Native American, and Anglo traditions. The vaquero, the original Mexican cowboy, became the model for the iconic American cowboy, sharing his knowledge of horsemanship and cattle ranching. This cultural exchange wasn't always smooth, and it was often marked by conflict and discrimination. But over time it created a new, hybrid identity for the region. The Southwest became a place where multiple cultures coexisted, sometimes clashing, but often blending to create something new and uniquely American. This enduring legacy reminds us that history isn't just about wars and treaties. It's about the everyday interactions of people and the rich, complex cultures that emerge from those connections. So, as we wrap up our look at the legacies of the war, it's clear that the consequences went far beyond the immediate outcome. It was a pivotal moment that not only reshaped the map, but also reshaped the destinies of two nations and the lives of countless individuals. It provided a real-world military education for the leaders who would soon command the largest armies ever seen on the continent during the Civil War. Their experiences in Mexico, both in combat and in command, would prove invaluable, for better or worse, in the devastating conflict to come. The war also etched a permanent border between the U.S. and Mexico, a line that continues to be a central feature of North American politics, economics, and social life. It's a border that defines sovereignty, but also one that is crossed by millions, a constant point of interaction and tension. And finally, in the vast territories that changed hands, a new society began to form. It was a society born from the convergence of Anglo, Hispanic, and indigenous worlds. This cultural blending gave the American Southwest its unique character, a rich heritage that continues to evolve and thrive. It serves as a powerful example of how, even from the ashes of conflict, new and vibrant cultures can arise, creating a legacy that is not one of division, but of fusion. History is a chain of events, and understanding the long-term legacies of one war helps us see the entire chain more clearly. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into Chapter 21. I hope it gave you a new perspective on how historical events continue to shape our world long after they're over. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss our next chapter. And as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think's the most significant legacy of this war? Let's get a conversation started. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. As the sun dips below the horizon, painting the western sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, a profound stillness begins to settle over the land. This is the U.S.-Mexico border, a line drawn across a continent, a place of convergence and division, of history and future. Tonight, we're not here to talk about politics or policies. We're here to listen, to observe, and to reflect on a continent at rest. From the bustling streets of Tijuana and San Diego, where the last murmurs of the day fade into a symphony of city lights, to the vast, silent expanse of the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts the landscape holds its breath. The air cools, carrying the scent of creosote and dust, ancient smells that have perfumed this land for millennia. The saguaro, cacti, like silent sentinels, stand silhouetted against the star-dusted canvas above, their arms reaching towards a sky that has witnessed everything. This border is more than just a line on a map. It's a living, breathing entity, etched by the forces of nature and the hand of man. It follows the winding path of the Rio Grande, or the Rio Bravo as it's known to the south, a silver ribbon carving its way through rugged canyons and fertile valleys. Tonight, its waters flow gently, reflecting the nascent moonlight, whispering tales of the past. It speaks of the empires that rose and fell, of the countless souls who sought passage across its currents, driven by dreams of a better life. Imagine standing here a century and a half ago. The air would have been thick with the smoke of campfires and the tension of conflict. The Mexican-American War was a crucible that forged the modern shapes of two nations. The mountains that loom in the distance, like the Sierra Madre and the Rockies, were not just geological formations. They were formidable barriers and strategic high grounds. Soldiers marched through these passes, their boots stirring the same dust that now settles on our cars and homes. The deserts were not just empty spaces, but unforgiving proving grounds that tested the limits of human endurance. The echoes of that war are faint now, absorbed by the land itself. But they linger. They're in the names of the cities: Corpus Christi, Palo Alto, Buena Vista. They are in the cultural tapestry of the borderlands, a unique blend of traditions, languages, and flavors that could only be born from such a complex history of conflict and coexistence. The war redrew the map, but it couldn't erase the shared heritage, the familial ties, and the deep-rooted connections that span the divide. As we journey eastward, the landscape transforms. The rugged mountains give way to the sprawling plains of Texas. Here, the border feels different, more integrated into the daily life of the communities. Towns like El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, or Laredo and Nuevo Laredo, are often called sister cities. They are two halves of a single heart, beating to a rhythm of cross-border commerce, culture, and family. At night, the lights of one city bleed seamlessly into the other, creating a single, sprawling constellation on the ground. It's a powerful reminder that, for the people who live here, the border is not an end, but a crossroads. The war that defined this line was fought over territory, over ideologies, over national pride. It was a period of immense upheaval and sorrow. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war in 1848, was a document of immense consequence. It ceded over half of Mexico's territory to the United States and area that now includes California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of several other states. It was a moment of profound loss for one nation and immense expansion for another. But history is not static. The wounds of the past, while deep, have been subject to the slow, persistent healing of time. The descendants of those who fought on both sides now live as neighbors. The stories of struggle and sacrifice have become part of a shared narrative, a foundation upon which a new, more nuanced relationship has been built. The quiet of the night allows us to appreciate this evolution. Think of the ghost towns that dot this region, remnants of mining booms and railroad ambitions that followed the war. Their skeletal remains stand as monuments to the relentless push westward, a direct consequence of the new territories acquired. The railroads, which crisscrossed this newly won land, were the arteries of a new American era, carrying settlers, goods, and ideas, forever changing the demographic and economic landscape. Tonight, under the vast, silent sky, the border is at peace. The jagged peaks of the Organ Mountains, near Las Cruces, are sharp against the moonlight. The great sand dunes of White Sands National Park, not far from the border, glow with an ethereal light. Their gypsum sands, shifting silently in the night breeze. This land has witnessed so much. It has absorbed the blood of battles, the tears of separation, and the sweat of labor. It has been a stage for conflict, a canvas for dreams, and a home for millions. As night deepens, the world seems to shrink. The great political and historical forces that shaped this place feel distant. What remains is the raw, physical reality of the land itself, the quiet dignity of the mountains, the patient expanse of the desert, the persistent flow of the river. They were here long before the war, long before the border, long before any of us. And they will remain long after we are gone. They are the silent keepers of memory. They don't take sides. They simply endure. In their quiet, we can find a space for reflection, a space to consider how the conflicts of the past have shaped the present, and how our actions today will shape the future. The border at night is not a line of separation, but a seam that holds a continent together, a place where history sleeps, and where the quiet promise of a new day waits just beyond the eastern horizon. This peaceful panorama, from the Pacific to the Gulf, is a testament to resilience, the resilience of the land, which heals and reclaims, and the resilience of the people who have learned to live with and across this line. The war is over. The battles have passed into history books. What is left is this: a continent at rest, breathing softly in the cool night air. And in that quiet, there is a profound and enduring peace. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found this reflection meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories etched in our landscape. Until next time, good night. And so, we come to the end of our story, not with the clang of swords or the roar of cannons, but with a quiet reflection as the day draws to a close. The year 1848 stands as a monumental turning point in the grand tapestry of American history. It wasn't just the end of a conflict. It was the dawn of a new era, a moment that redrew the map not only of a nation but of its very identity and destiny. Think of it like a river that suddenly carves a new path through the landscape. Everything that comes after is shaped by that single, powerful shift. The war with Mexico was that powerful shift. The lands gained were vast, stretching from the sun-drenched coasts of California to the rugged mountains of the Rockies. This wasn't merely an addition of territory. It was an infusion of new cultures, new peoples, and new challenges. The United States, once a nation largely defined by its Atlantic heritage, now had its gaze fixed firmly on the Pacific horizon. The dream of a continental nation, a destiny that many believed was manifest, had been realized. But with this great expansion came great questions. Questions that would echo through the halls of Congress and across the dinner tables of ordinary families. What would become of this new land? Would it be a land of freedom for all? Or would the shadows of division stretch across its beautiful plains and valleys? These were the seeds of future conflicts, sown in the very soil that had been so recently won. The addition of this territory intensified the already simmering debate over slavery, pushing the nation closer to the brink of its greatest trial, the Civil War. It's a somber reminder that even in moments of great triumph, the threads of future struggles are often woven. But let's not end our story on a note of impending conflict. Let's instead think about the people, the soldiers who returned home, carrying with them stories of distant lands and a new understanding of their country. The pioneers who would soon pack their wagons, their hots giretus with hopi ready to brave the unknown trails westward. The people who already lived in these lands, whose lives were forever changed, their stories now intertwined with that of a new nation. Each of them had a part to play in the unfolding drama of America. History, you see, is not just a collection of dates and battles. It's a collection of human stories, of dreams and disappointments, of courage and consequence. The events of 1848 were a pivotal chapter in that grand, ongoing story. It was a time of immense change, a moment when the country took a deep breath and stepped into a larger, more complicated, and more expansive version of itself. It reminds us that nations, like people, are constantly evolving, constantly being shaped by choices and circumstances. As you drift off to sleep, imagine the quiet of the vast American West in the years following the war. Picture the first flickers of new towns, the slow crawl of wagon trains under a canopy of stars, the meeting of different cultures on a new frontier. It was a time of both great promise and great uncertainty, a landscape of dreams waiting to be built. The legacy of 1848 is all around us, in the names of our cities, the diversity of our people, and the sheer scale of the country we know today. It's a chapter that has long since closed, but its echo continues to resonate. The story of the past is a guide for the present and a lamp for the future. It teaches us about ambition, about the cost of conflict, and about the enduring human spirit that seeks to build, to explore, and to create a better world. The story of 1848 is a powerful piece of that lesson, a tale of a nation on the move, grappling with its own identity as it stretched its borders from sea to shining sea. It's a story of how a single turning point can change the course of history forever. Thank you for joining me on this journey through a fascinating, informative time. I hope these stories have given you a new perspective and perhaps a little peace as you end your day. The past is full of incredible tales, and there are always more to discover. For now, let the lessons and images of this chapter settle gently in your mind. May you have a peaceful and restful night, filled with sweet dreams. Thank you for listening, and until next time, sleep well.